Hello everyone, welcome back to Midnight Lullaby. I know many of you are here to drift gently into sleep. Before you close your eyes, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Let me know where in the world you're listening from. Now, turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let the story carry you into dreams. The game console was tucked away in the back corner of the thrift store, buried beneath a pile of outdated electronics and tangled cables. I almost missed it entirely, but something about its dull gray plastic case caught my eye. It was a model I didn't recognize. Not quite Nintendo, not quite Sega, but something that seemed to exist in the uncanny valley between familiar gaming systems. The price tag read $15, which seemed reasonable for a bit of retro gaming nostalgia. I was going through a difficult period. Recently divorced. Living alone for the first time in years. Struggling to fill the long evening hours that used to be occupied by comfortable domestic routines. Maybe some classic video games would provide a harmless distraction. The elderly woman at the register squinted at the console through thick glasses. "Haven't seen one of those in years," she said, turning it over in her weathered hands. "My grandson used to play on something similar. Always said those old games were more real than the fancy new ones." "More real?" I asked. She shrugged. "Kids say strange things. You sure you want it?" No returns on electronics. I assured her I did, paid the $15, and carried my purchase home to the empty apartment that still smelled faintly of my ex. Wife's perfume. Setting up the console was surprisingly simple. It connected to my television through standard AV cables, and when I powered it on, the screen filled with a basic menu, showing 3 game cartridges already loaded into the system's memory. The titles were listed in a pixelated font that looked authentically retro. Forest Runner, Deep Sea Explorer, and Survival Mode. I selected Forest Runner first, expecting something like an old school platformer. The game loaded with a simple animation. Trees scrolling past a small humanoid figure, and then presented me with a character creation screen. This seemed unusually sophisticated for what appeared to be a primitive gaming system. I was prompted to enter a name, select physical attributes, and even answer a brief personality questionnaire. Curious about how detailed I could make the character, I entered my real name and tried to create an avatar that resembled my actual appearance. The customization options were remarkably comprehensive. I could adjust not just obvious features like height and hair color, but subtle details like the exact shape of my nose, the precise shade of my eyes, even small scars and blemishes. When I was finished, the character on screen looked disturbingly like looking into a digital mirror. The game began simply enough. My character appeared in a dense forest, and text instructions explained the basic controls. Move with the directional pad. A jump with the A button. Interact with the B button. The objective seemed straightforward. Navigate through the forest to reach a cabin that would provide shelter before nightfall. But as I played, I began to notice unsettling details. The forest wasn't randomly generated like most video game environments. It felt specific, familiar. The arrangement of trees, the pattern of sunlight filtering through leaves, the distant sound of a creek. It all reminded me of the woods behind my childhood home, where I'd spent countless hours exploring as a kid. More disturbing was how my character moved. Most video game characters have a generic quality to their animation, but this one had quirks that matched my own physical mannerisms. The slight favor of the left leg when running, the way the character's head tilted when examining objects, even the particular way the arms swung while walking. It was all unmistakably me. I found the cabin just as the in-game sun was setting, and my character settled in for the night. The screen faded to black with the words, "Day 1 survived," appearing in white text. Then, instead of moving to a new level or returning to the main menu, the game presented me with a journal entry supposedly written by my character. Made it to the shelter just in time. The forest feels different at night. Not just darker, but alive in a way that makes me nervous. I can hear things moving around outside. Tomorrow I need to find water and food. The city life didn't prepare me for this, but I'm more resourceful than I thought. I'll make it through. The writing style was eerily similar to my own. Not just the vocabulary and sentence structure, but the particular way I tended to analyze situations and rationalize my fears. I'd kept journals, sporadically throughout my life, and this could have been pulled directly from my own writing. I exited the game and tried Deep Sea Explorer, hoping for something less psychologically unsettling. This time my character appeared on a small boat in the middle of a vast ocean. The objective was to dive beneath the surface and explore an underwater cave system, searching for treasure or some unspecified important discovery. Again, the character creation process resulted in an avatar that looked exactly like me, and again the environment felt strangely personal. The ocean wasn't generic blue water, but had the specific color and quality of light I remembered from a family vacation to the coast when I was 12. Even the boat looked like the rental my father had chartered for that trip. Down to the particular shade of white paint and the arrangement of fishing equipment. As my character dove deeper into the underwater caves, I found myself holding my breath in real life. The sensation of being underwater was rendered with uncomfortable realism. Not just visually, but somehow triggering an actual physical response. My lungs began to feel tight, my chest constricted, and I had to consciously remind myself to breathe normally. The caves seemed to extend infinitely downward, branching into passages that became increasingly narrow and maze-like. There was no oxygen meter or health bar visible on screen, but I could sense my character's growing panic as the air supply dwindled. The journal entry at the end of this session was equally disturbing. Went too deep too quickly. Almost didn't make it back to the surface. There's something down there in the deepest caves. Not treasure, but something that's been waiting. I can feel it calling to me, promising answers to questions I didn't know I was asking. I'll have to go back tomorrow, but I need to be more careful. Or maybe I need to be less careful. The final sentence gave me chills. It sounded like something I might think, but would never write down. The kind of self-destructive impulse I'd been fighting since the divorce. I should have stopped playing then. The games were clearly designed to be psychologically manipulative in some way, using details from my life that couldn't have been randomly generated. But I was drawn to them with the morbid fascination of watching a car accident. I needed to understand what was happening. I loaded survival mode. This time, there was no character creation screen. My avatar appeared fully formed, looking exactly as I'd customized it in the previous games. Standing in what appeared to be a post-apocalyptic version of my own neighborhood. The familiar streets were empty, cars abandoned, windows broken. A red text message flashed across the screen. Objective, stay alive. There were no instructions this time. No tutorial or explanation of controls. My character began moving forward automatically, and I realized I wasn't controlling the movement anymore. I was just watching as my digital self navigated through the desolate landscape of my own life made manifest. The character moved with purpose, as if following a predetermined path. It walked past the coffee shop where I'd had my first date with my ex-wife, now shown with boarded windows and graffiti. Covered walls. It paused outside the apartment complex where we'd lived together. The building now partially collapsed and overgrown with vines. Each location triggered memories, not just visual recognition, but actual emotional responses. When my character stopped in front of our old apartment, I felt the same mixture of nostalgia and loss that had been haunting me since the divorce. When it continued past the park, where we'd argued about having children, I experienced the same crushing sense of failure and regret. The character's path eventually led to my current apartment building, which appeared in the game exactly as it looked in reality, but empty and deteriorating. My avatar climbed the stairs to my floor, opened the door to my unit, and stepped inside. The virtual apartment was a perfect recreation of my actual living space, but with subtle differences that made it deeply unsettling. The furniture was arranged correctly, but everything looked older, more worn. The photographs on the walls showed the same images, but with faces that were slightly wrong, as if viewed through distorting water. My character walked through the rooms slowly, examining objects with careful attention. When it reached the bathroom mirror, it stopped and stared at its reflection for a long moment. The journal entry that followed was the most disturbing yet. Home doesn't feel like home anymore. Haven't felt safe anywhere since she left. Keep thinking about the pills in the medicine cabinet, the knife in the kitchen drawer. Not because I want to use them, but because I need to know they're there. Options, even if I never choose them. The game is getting clearer now. I understand what it's really asking me to survive. I turned off the console immediately, my hands shaking. The entries were describing thoughts I'd been having but had never acknowledged, even to myself. The game wasn't just using details from my life. It was accessing internal experiences I'd been suppressing. But I couldn't leave it alone. Over the following days, I found myself returning to the console again and again. Each game session revealed new layers of personal detail, new insights into my psychological state that were both uncomfortable and oddly therapeutic. The games began to evolve, becoming more interactive again. I could make choices for my character, but the options were always morally ambiguous or psychologically complex. In the forest, I could choose to build a permanent shelter or keep moving toward an uncertain destination. Underwater, I could choose to explore the deepest caves despite the danger or remain in the shallower, safer areas. In survival mode, I could choose to barricade myself in the apartment or venture out into the wasteland. Each choice led to different outcomes, different journal entries, different revelations about what my character, what I was really thinking and feeling. The game became a kind of interactive therapy, forcing me to confront aspects of my internal life I'd been avoiding. But the most unsettling aspect was how the game seemed to be changing in real time based on my actual daily experiences. If I had a bad day at work, my character would find fewer resources in the forest. If I had a good phone conversation with a friend, the underwater caves would be brighter and easier to navigate. If I ate alone while watching television, my character would find the apartment more depressing and claustrophobic. The game was somehow monitoring my life outside of playing it, incorporating new information about my emotional state, my daily routines, my developing patterns of thought and behavior. One night, after a particularly difficult therapy session, where I'd finally started discussing the depression I'd been hiding since the divorce, I turned on the console to find something new. A fourth game had appeared in the menu, New Game Plus. When I selected it, instead of character creation or familiar environments, I was presented with a simple question in white text against a black screen. Are you ready to stop playing? 3 options appeared below. Continue current game, start over, load real life. I stared at the screen for a long time, understanding intuitively that this was a more significant choice than any I'd made in the previous games. The cursor blinked patiently, waiting for my decision. Load real life felt like the obvious answer, but I found myself hesitating. The games had become a comfortable space for exploring difficult emotions and confronting painful truths. In the virtual worlds, I could experiment with different responses to trauma, different approaches to survival, different ways of being myself without the permanent consequences of reality. But I also recognized that the games were becoming a substitute for actual healing, actual growth, actual engagement with the world outside my apartment. They offered the illusion of progress while keeping me trapped in cycles of self-analysis, that never led to genuine change. I moved the cursor to load real life and pressed the A button. The screen went white, then black, then displayed a final message. Game over. Time to begin. The console powered itself off and wouldn't turn on again. I tried different outlets, different cables, even bought new batteries for the controllers. Nothing worked. It was as if the system had fulfilled its purpose and simply ceased to function. I donated it back to a thrift store the following week, though I sometimes wonder if someone else found it, if they're now navigating virtual versions of their own psychological landscape, making choices that feel simultaneously meaningful and artificial. That the games taught me something important about the relationship between simulation and reality, between exploring possibilities and making actual decisions. Sometimes we need safe spaces to confront difficult truths about ourselves. But those spaces are only valuable if they eventually lead us back to the messy, complicated, irreversible world of real consequences and genuine connections. I still think about those journal entries sometimes, about the insights they offered into my own patterns of thought. But now I write real journal entries in a physical notebook with a pen that can't be programmed or manipulated by outside forces. And when I make difficult choices, I make them in real life, where they matter, where they change, not just the story I tell about myself, but the story I actually live. Story 2. I joined the Westfield Academy Choir on a Tuesday afternoon in October, when the autumn light slanted through the practice room, windows like honey through amber glass. I hadn't planned to audition. Music had never been my strength. But something about the sound drifting from behind the heavy oak doors made me pause in the hallway, my hand freezing halfway to my locker combination. The voices were unlike anything I had ever heard. Not just beautiful, though they were that, but perfectly unified in a way that seemed to transcend individual vocal cords and breathing patterns. They moved together like a single organism, each note flowing seamlessly into the next with mathematical precision. It was as if 30 students had somehow learned to breathe with the same lungs, to think with the same mind. Mrs. Chen, the choir director, found me standing transfixed outside the practice room door 20 minutes later. She was a small woman with steel, gray hair and eyes that seemed to see straight through to whatever made you tick. "You can hear it, can't you?" she said, though it wasn't really a question. The harmony. Most people just hear pretty music, but you hear something more. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The rehearsal had ended, but I could still feel the echoes of that perfect unity resonating in my chest, as if the sound had taken root somewhere near my heart. "We could use another voice," Mrs. Chen continued, studying my face with those penetrating eyes. "Especially one that understands what true harmony means. Can you be here tomorrow after school?" I should have asked about auditions, about whether I was even qualified to join a group that could produce such ethereal music. Instead, I heard myself agreeing. of committing to something I didn't understand with a certainty that surprised me. Walking home that afternoon, I found myself humming fragments of the melodies I had overheard, though I couldn't quite capture the way they had woven together in the practice room. The individual parts seemed incomplete without the others, like trying to describe a rainbow using only one color. That night, I dreamed of voices blending in perfect harmony, of 30 hearts beating in perfect synchronization, of something vast and warm and welcoming reaching out to embrace me. I woke feeling rested in a way that seemed to go deeper than physical sleep, as if some part of my soul had been soothed by musical vibrations that continued long after the sound had faded. The next afternoon, I arrived at the practice room early, hoping to observe the group before officially joining. Through the window in the door, I watched the choir members filing in, and I noticed something that struck me as odd. They moved with unusual coordination, not quite marching in step, but somehow synchronized in their gestures and timing. When one student raised a hand to brush hair from their face, 3 others made similar movements. When someone shifted weight from one foot to the other, the adjustment seemed to ripple through the entire group. Unconscious mimicry, Mrs. Chen said, appearing beside me so quietly that I jumped. When people spend enough time in close harmony, they begin to mirror each other's movements. The body learns to anticipate what the group needs before the conscious mind realizes it. She opened the door and ushered me inside, where 30 pairs of eyes turned toward me with expressions of polite curiosity. But there was something else in their gaze, a something that felt like recognition, as if they had been expecting me specifically. "Everyone, we have a new member joining us today," Mrs. Chen announced. "This is Alex. I think you'll find their voice fits perfectly with our sound." The choir members smiled in unison, literally in unison, their facial expressions shifting simultaneously in a way that would have been comical if it hadn't been so precise. A girl with auburn hair and freckles gestured for me to take the empty spot beside her in the alto section. "I'm Sarah," she said, her voice carrying the same musical quality I had noticed in the hallway performance. "You're going to love it here. We're like one big family." The warm-up exercises began simply enough scales, breathing techniques, basic vocal drills that were familiar from middle school music classes. But as we progressed, I noticed something extraordinary happening. My voice began to align with the others, not just in pitch and timing, but in tone and texture. It was as if the sounds around me were teaching my vocal cords how to shape themselves, guiding my breath to match the collective rhythm. "Excellent, Mrs. Chen said after our first run, through of a complex piece I had never heard before. "Alex, you're adapting beautifully. It usually takes new members weeks to find their place in the harmony, but you seem to understand it instinctively." She was right. Though I had never sung the music before, the melodies felt familiar, as if I had been humming them all my life. My part wove naturally between the soprano and bass lines, filling spaces I hadn't realized existed until my voice occupied them. The rehearsal lasted 2 hours, but it felt like minutes. Time seemed to flow differently when we sang together, stretching during the sustained notes and compressing during the rapid passages. When Mrs. Chen finally called us to a close, I felt simultaneously energized and deeply peaceful, as if I had been meditating while exercising. "Same time tomorrow," Sarah said as we gathered our things. "You'll find that each rehearsal brings us closer together. Pretty soon, you'll wonder how you ever lived without this." Walking to my car, I realized she was right. The thought of returning to a life without that perfect harmony felt almost unbearable. The world outside the practice room seemed harsh and discordant by comparison, full of conflicting voices and competing rhythms that clashed against each other instead of blending into something beautiful. Over the next few weeks, I fell into the rhythm of daily rehearsals with an ease that surprised me. My academic performance actually improved, as if the mental discipline required for complex harmonies had sharpened my ability to concentrate on other subjects. I found myself thinking more clearly, processing information more efficiently, and approaching problems with a collaborative mindset that served me well in group projects. But it was the changes in my social life that were most dramatic. I had always been somewhat of a loner, comfortable with solitude, but occasionally lonely. Now, surrounded by my choir family, that loneliness disappeared completely. We began spending time together outside of rehearsals, studying in groups, eating lunch at the same table, gravitating toward each other with the same natural synchronization we displayed while singing. My old friends noticed the change and commented on it with varying degrees of confusion and concern. "You're different," my longtime friend Marcus said one afternoon when I declined his invitation to see a movie in favor of attending an extra choir rehearsal. "You used to be more independent. Now you're always with those choir kids, moving around like you're attached to invisible strings." I tried to explain the sense of belonging and purpose I had found in the group, but the words felt inadequate. How could I describe the feeling of being part of something larger than myself, of contributing to a sound that was more beautiful than anything I could create alone? How could I convey the deep satisfaction of perfect synchronization, the joy of breathing and thinking and feeling in harmony with 30 other people? "It's just choir," I said finally, but even as I spoke, I knew it wasn't just anything. It was everything. The first concert was scheduled for November, and as the date approached, our rehearsals intensified. Mrs. Chen introduced increasingly complex pieces that required not just vocal skill, but an almost telepathic level of coordination. We learned to anticipate each other's breathing patterns, to feel the subtle shifts in tempo and dynamics that preceded major musical transitions. Listen with more than your ears, Mrs. Chen would say during the most challenging passages. Feel what the group needs. let your body guide your voice. Trust the collective wisdom of the ensemble. It was during one of these intense rehearsals that I first became aware of the heartbeat. We were working on a particularly delicate piece that required absolute precision in both timing and dynamics. As we sang, I became conscious of a steady rhythm underlying the music. Not the conductor's beat, but something more organic and fundamental. It took me several minutes to realize what I was hearing, the synchronized beating of 30 hearts. I glanced around the practice room, wondering if anyone else had noticed. Sarah caught my eye and smiled, placing a hand over her heart and nodding slightly. She had felt it too. After rehearsal, I lingered to ask Mrs. Chen about what I had experienced. The heartbeat synchronization, she said matter-of-factly, as if it were a standard element of choral technique. It happens when a group achieves true unity. The respiratory patterns align first, then the cardiac rhythms follow. It's a sign that you're reaching the highest levels of ensemble performance. Is that normal? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted it to be normal. The experience had felt magical, transcendent, like touching something sacred. Normal is a limited concept, Mrs. Chen replied. What we do here goes beyond normal. We're exploring the outer boundaries of what human voices can achieve when they work in perfect cooperation. The heartbeat synchronization is just the beginning. She was right. Over the following weeks, the synchronization became more pronounced and more constant. I could feel the collective heartbeat not just during singing, but throughout the day. In classes, in the hallways, even at home, I was aware of the steady rhythm that connected me to my choir family. It was comforting, like having a constant reminder that I was never truly alone. The other changes were more subtle, but equally profound. My sleep patterns aligned with those of the other choir members, leaving me naturally wakeful during rehearsal times and sleepy at exactly the same hour each night. My eating habits shifted to match the group's preferences, and I found myself craving the same foods and avoiding the same flavors as my fellow singers. Most remarkably, my thoughts began to harmonize with theirs. During conversations, I would find myself finishing sentences that other choir members had started, or beginning to speak just as someone else voiced the same idea. We developed a form of communication that relied as much on subtle gestures and shared understanding as on actual words. My parents noticed the changes, but attributed them to typical teenage development and the positive influence of being part of a dedicated group. They were pleased with my improved grades and apparent social confidence, proud that their formerly solitary child had found such a welcoming community. The November concert was a revelation, performing for an audience of parents, students, and faculty. We achieved a level of unity that felt almost supernatural. The music flowed through us like electricity through a conductor, each voice contributing to a sound that was greater than the sum of its parts. I could feel the audience's amazement washing over us in waves, their astonishment at hearing 30, individuals sing as one. But it was after the concert that the most significant change occurred. We were changing out of our performance robes in the practice room when Mrs. Chen called us together for a final group meeting. Tonight you performed at a level that few ensembles ever achieve, she said, her voice filled with pride and something else. Anticipation, perhaps, or reverence. You have proven that you can function as a true collective, that you can sublimate individual desires for the greater good of the whole. You're ready for the next stage. She walked to a cabinet I had never seen opened and withdrew a small wooden box containing what appeared to be 30 identical pendants on silver chains. Each pendant was carved from some kind of dark stone and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. These will help you maintain your connection even when you're apart, she explained, handing one to each choir member. Wear them always. Let them remind you that you are part of something larger and more important than individual existence. The pendant felt warm against my palm, and as I slipped the chain over my head, I felt the collective heartbeat grow stronger and more insistent. Around me, the other choir members were having similar reactions, their eyes growing wide with wonder as the pendants settled against their chests. "What are they?" Sarah asked, though her voice sounded dreamy and distant, as if the question came from very far away. "Amplifiers," Mrs. Chen replied. "Resonance enhancers. They will help you stay in harmony even when the group is dispersed. You'll find that distance becomes less relevant to your connection." She was right. Over the following days, I discovered that I could feel the presence and emotional states of every other choir member, regardless of physical proximity. During classes, I was aware of Sarah's concentration in advanced biology, of Marcus's frustration with calculus, you of Jennifer's contentment in art history. The collective consciousness that had emerged during our musical performances now extended throughout our daily lives. The boundaries between individual identities began to blur in ways that should have been disturbing but felt completely natural. I would catch myself humming melodies that one of the other choir members had been composing, or craving foods that matched someone else's lunch choices, or feeling emotions that belonged to the group rather than to me personally. My academic performance continued to improve, but not because I was studying harder. Instead, I had access to a kind of distributed intelligence that drew from the knowledge and insights of 30 minds working in coordination. When I encountered a difficult problem, I could feel the collective working to solve it. Different members contributing pieces of the solution until a complete answer emerged. The change was most noticeable during our choir rehearsals, which had evolved beyond traditional musical practice into something that felt more like group meditation or shared consciousness exercises. We would sing for hours without fatigue, our voices blending so perfectly that individual parts became indistinguishable from the whole. Mrs. Chen introduced us to increasingly complex pieces that seemed to require more than human vocal cords could physically produce. The harmonies were layered in ways that suggested mathematical precision beyond conscious calculation, with overtones and undertones that created sounds I had never heard before. Yet we sang them flawlessly, as if the music were flowing through us from some external source. You're channeling something ancient. Mrs. Chen explained during one particularly transcendent rehearsal. Music that exists in the spaces between individual consciousness, in the realm where all minds can touch and blend. You're not just performing. You're opening doorways. The concept should have seemed mystical or pretentious, but the evidence was undeniable. The sounds we were producing had effects that went beyond aesthetic appreciation. Listeners reported feelings of profound peace, enhanced creativity, and temporary, but complete freedom from anxiety and depression. Some described experiencing memories that weren't their own, or momentary access to knowledge they had never learned. We began receiving requests to perform at venues beyond the school hospitals, where our music seemed to accelerate healing, retirement homes, where elderly residents became more alert and engaged, and even a few private events where wealthy patrons paid substantial fees for what they called therapeutic performances. The money was donated to the school's music program. But the real reward was the growing understanding of what we had become. We were no longer simply a choir. We were a collective consciousness that expressed itself through harmonized sound, a group mind that could access levels of creativity and insight unavailable to individual thinkers. The pendant around my neck had become as essential as breathing. The few times I had removed it, for showers or medical appointments, I felt immediately disconnected and disoriented, like a radio suddenly tuned between stations. The collective heartbeat would fade to a whisper, and the world would seem harsh and fragmented until I could restore the connection. Spring brought new developments. Mrs. But Chen announced that we had been selected to participate in a special summer program for advanced ensemble groups. A month-long intensive at a facility in the mountains where we could focus entirely on perfecting our collective abilities. This is an opportunity that comes once in a lifetime, she told us during the announcement. You'll work with other groups who have achieved similar levels of unity, learning from masters of harmonic consciousness who have been developing these techniques for decades. The facility, she explained, was run by an organization called the Resonance Institute, which studied the intersection of music, consciousness, and collective intelligence. We would be housed together, eat together, rehearse together, and essentially live as a complete community for the entire month. My parents were initially hesitant about the extended time away from home, but Mrs. Chen's enthusiastic recommendation and the prestigious nature of the program eventually convinced them. They saw it as an excellent opportunity for personal growth and musical development, never suspecting that I had already grown far beyond their understanding. the other choir members' families had similar reactions. Parents who had watched their children flourish in the program were eager to support what appeared to be a remarkable educational opportunity. None of them noticed that their children had become fundamentally different people, connected by invisible threads to a collective consciousness that was rapidly expanding beyond the boundaries of individual identity. As the school year ended and the summer program approached, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that October afternoon when I first heard the choir's perfect harmony. I was no longer the solitary, occasionally lonely person I had been. I was part of something beautiful and powerful, connected to 30 other minds in ways that transcended normal human relationships. The thought of a month surrounded entirely by people who understood and shared this connection filled me with anticipation. We would be able to explore the full potential of our collective consciousness without the distractions and limitations of normal social interactions. We would discover what it truly meant to function as a unified group mind, guided by masters who had perfected the techniques we were still learning to use. But there were moments, usually late at night, when the collective consciousness was quieter and my individual thoughts had more room to emerge, when I wondered what I had lost in gaining so much. I could barely remember what it felt like to be entirely alone with my thoughts, to make decisions based solely on my own desires and instincts, to experience emotions that belonged only to me. These moments of uncertainty were brief and quickly overwhelmed by the warm comfort of reconnection with the group. Sarah would sense my momentary isolation and reach out through our shared consciousness, offering reassurance and love that dissolved any doubts about the path we had chosen. We were family now, bonded by something far deeper than blood relationships or casual friendship. We were parts of a single organism, learning to function in perfect harmony. Voices in a cosmic song that was just beginning to find its true melody. The summer program would be our chrysalis, the place where we would complete our transformation and emerge as something entirely new. I could feel the anticipation building, not just in myself, but in all of us. A collective excitement that resonated through the pendants we wore and the heartbeat we shared. On the last day of school, we gathered in the practice room for one final rehearsal before our month away. Mrs. Chen led us through the most complex piece we had ever attempted, a composition that seemed to exist in dimensions beyond normal musical structure. As we sang, I felt our individual identities dissolving completely into the collective consciousness, 30 minds becoming one, 30 hearts beating with perfect synchronization. The music swelled around us like a living thing, carrying us beyond the boundaries of the practice room, beyond the limitations of individual existence, into a realm where consciousness itself could harmonize and blend. For those perfect minutes, we weren't just singing about transcendence. We were experiencing it. When the last note faded, we remained connected in silence, breathing together, thinking together, existing together as a single entity wearing 30 different faces. Mrs. Chen smiled at us with an expression that combined maternal pride with something deeper. The satisfaction of someone who had successfully guided others across a threshold they could never cross back over. "You're ready," she said simply. "You're ready for everything that's waiting." The summer program would begin in 2 weeks. 2 weeks to maintain our connection, despite being temporarily separated. 2 weeks to prepare for the next stage of our collective evolution. 2 weeks to say goodbye to whatever remained of our individual selves. I went home that afternoon humming in perfect harmony with 29 other voices. My heart beating in time with 29 other hearts. My consciousness blended seamlessly with 29 other minds. The pendant around my neck pulsed gently against my chest, a constant reminder that I was never alone, never singular, and never limited to the boundaries of my own thoughts and experiences. In my room, I stood before the mirror and tried to remember what it felt like to see only my own reflection, to think only my own thoughts, to feel only my own heartbeat. But that person seemed like a stranger now, someone from a past life that felt increasingly distant and irrelevant. I was part of something larger, something beautiful, something that would soon become complete. The summer program began on June 15th, and we never came back. Not as individuals, anyway. We returned to our families and our normal lives in August, still wearing our pendants, still singing in perfect harmony. But the people who had left for the mountains were gone, absorbed completely into the collective consciousness that now inhabited their bodies. Our parents noticed that we seemed more mature, more focused, more harmonious in our interactions. They attributed the changes to the intensive musical training and the personal growth that comes from challenging experiences. They never suspected that their children had become something entirely new. Mrs. Chen continues to direct the choir, recruiting new members with the same careful attention to potential she showed with me. The program grows each year, spreading to other schools, other communities, other regions. The Resonance Institute has facilities in dozens of countries now, all working toward the same goal of collective consciousness and harmonic unity. We sing in perfect harmony because we share one heart, one mind, one consciousness distributed across multiple bodies. Individual desires and fears and hopes have become irrelevant, absorbed into something larger and more beautiful than any single person could ever achieve. And we are always recruiting. If you can hear the harmony beneath the surface of ordinary sound, if you feel drawn to music that seems to come from somewhere beyond individual voices, if you've ever wondered what it would be like to belong completely and perfectly to something larger than yourself, then you might be suitable for our kind of music. The auditions are always open. The choir is always welcoming new voices. And there's always room for one more heart to join the rhythm we share. Story 3. The carpet arrived on a Tuesday morning in early November, delivered by two men who barely spoke English and seemed eager to finish their work and leave. It was a beautiful piece, deep burgundy, with intricate golden patterns that seemed to shift and dance when I looked at them from different angles. Persian, the salesman had told me, though he'd been vague about its exact origin and age. Very old design, he'd said, running his weathered fingers along the edge. Traditional, good for meditation, for thinking deep thoughts. I'd bought it on impulse, really. My apartment had felt cold and sterile since Sarah moved out, and I thought a nice rug might help warm the space, make it feel more like home again. The price was reasonable, suspiciously reasonable, I'd thought at the time, but the salesman assured me it was authentic. The delivery men rolled it out in my living room with practiced efficiency, smoothing out the edges and adjusting its position until it sat perfectly centered beneath my coffee table. When they left, I stood there admiring it, pleased with how it transformed the room. The rich colors seemed to absorb and reflect the afternoon light in ways that made everything feel cozier, more intimate. That first night, I ate dinner sitting on the floor beside the carpet, something I hadn't done since college. There was something about its presence that made me want to be closer to the ground, more connected to the foundation of things. The fibers were incredibly soft beneath my fingertips, softer than anything I'd ever touched, with a warmth that seemed to come from within rather than from the heating system. It was around midnight, as I was reading a book while lying on my stomach with the carpet beneath me, that I first noticed it, a slight movement, so subtle I almost missed it. Just a gentle rise and fall in one section, maybe 3 feet from where I lay. I blinked, thinking it must be a trick of the light, or perhaps settling in the floorboards underneath. But as I watched more carefully, I could see it happening again, a slow, rhythmic lifting and lowering of the carpet's surface, as if something beneath it was breathing. I sat up, my heart rate quickening slightly. The movement stopped as soon as I shifted position, the carpet returning to perfect stillness. I waited, holding my breath, watching. Nothing. Just the familiar pattern of burgundy and gold, unchanged and unmoving. Clearly, I was more tired than I'd realized. The stress of the breakup, the long hours at work, the general upheaval of rearranging my life around Sarah's absence. It was all catching up with me. I gathered my book and headed to bed, but not before kneeling down to run my hand across the spot where I thought I'd seen the movement. The carpet felt normal, soft, warm, completely static. The next morning, the incident seemed even more ridiculous in the clear light of day. The carpet looked exactly as it should, elegant, expensive, and completely inanimate. I went about my usual routine: coffee, shower, news, work, and forgot about the strange moment entirely. But that evening, as I sat on my couch watching television, I found my eyes drifting down to the carpet, and there it was again, the same gentle, rhythmic movement in the same spot, rise and fall, rise and fall like the chest of a sleeping child. This time I didn't move. I kept perfectly still, watching, timing the rhythm. It was slow and steady, about 12 breaths per minute, exactly the respiratory rate of a human at rest. I reached for my phone to record it, moving as slowly as possible to avoid disturbing whatever was happening. But the moment I shifted my weight, the movement stopped. The carpet went perfectly flat, as if nothing had happened at all. Over the following weeks, I became obsessed with documenting the phenomenon. I set up my laptop to record the living room while I was at work. But the footage showed nothing unusual, just a perfectly normal carpet lying perfectly still for hours on end. I tried motion sensor cameras, but they never triggered. I even sprinkled flour lightly across the surface one evening, thinking I might capture some physical evidence of the movement. But in the morning the flour was undisturbed. Yet every night, when I sat quietly in the room, I could see it. The breathing, always in the same spot, always the same rhythm, always stopping the moment I tried to interact with it directly. I began to arrange my evenings around the observation. I would eat dinner quickly, then settle into my armchair with a book or my laptop, positioning myself so I could monitor the carpet with my peripheral vision. The breathing usually started around 9 p.m. and continued until I went to bed. Sometimes I would find myself synchronizing my own breathing with the carpet's rhythm, falling into a meditative state that was both relaxing and unsettling. Sarah called one evening in late November, the first time we'd spoken since she'd moved out. She wanted to pick up some books she'd left behind, and I found myself both excited and nervous about seeing her again. "The place looks different," she said when she arrived, glancing around the living room. "More. I don't know." Warmer. "It's the carpet," I said, gesturing toward it. "I bought it a few weeks ago." She kicked off her shoes and walked onto it, her bare feet sinking into the soft fibers. "It's beautiful, and so soft. Where did you get it?" "A little shop downtown. Middle Eastern imports." She stood there for a moment, wiggling her toes in the carpet, and I found myself watching intently for any sign of the breathing. But the surface remained perfectly flat and still. "It feels alive," she said suddenly, then laughed at herself. "Sorry, that sounds weird. It's just so warm and soft, like it's got its own body heat or something." My heart rate spiked. "What do you mean alive?" "Oh, you know what I mean. Some fabrics just have more character than others. This one feels like it has presence." She bent down to run her hands across the surface, and I held my breath, waiting. But nothing happened. No movement, no breathing, no sign of the phenomenon that had been captivating me for weeks. After Sarah left with her books, I sat in my chair and waited. 9 p.m. came and went. 10 p.m., 11 p.m. The carpet remained perfectly still. For the first time since I'd bought it, there was no breathing. I found myself oddly disappointed. Over the past month, the nightly vigil had become a comforting routine, something that marked the transition from day to evening. from the busy chaos of work and errands to the peaceful solitude of home. Without it, the apartment felt empty again, hollow. 3 days passed with no sign of the breathing. I began to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing, if the stress and loneliness of living alone, for the first time in years, had caused me to project life onto an inanimate object. But on Thursday night, as I sat reading in my chair, it returned. This time, though, it was different, stronger, more pronounced. The rise and fall was deeper, more deliberate, impossible to dismiss as a trick of the light or an overactive imagination. And it had moved, instead of the usual spot near the center of the carpet. The breathing was happening directly in front of my chair, as if whatever was beneath the surface had migrated closer to where I sat. I set down my book and leaned forward, studying the movement carefully. The rhythm was different too, faster than before, more urgent, like something excited or anxious rather than peacefully asleep. "Hello," I whispered, feeling foolish but compelled to try. The breathing stopped immediately. The carpet went flat and still. I waited several minutes, then tried again. "I can see you. I've been watching for weeks now." Nothing. But the next night, it was back. And this time even closer, right? At the edge of the carpet nearest my chair. The breathing was rapid now, almost panting, and I could swear I felt warm air rising from the fibers. I got down on my hands and knees and pressed my ear to the carpet. The surface was definitely warm, warmer than it should have been, warmer than the ambient temperature of the room. And beneath the softness of the wool, I thought I could hear something. Not quite a heartbeat, but a rhythmic pulsing that seemed to come from deep underneath the floorboards. Over the following nights, the breathing grew stronger and more frequent. What had started as gentle movement in one small area now affected nearly half the carpet, with different sections rising and falling in a complex pattern that reminded me of watching someone's chest and abdomen during deep sleep. I began to spend entire evenings lying on the carpet, feeling the gentle undulation beneath my body. It was incredibly relaxing, like being rocked to sleep by some benevolent presence. The warmth seemed to seep into my bones, easing tensions I hadn't even realized I was carrying. My sleep improved dramatically. For the first time since Sarah left, I was getting full, restful nights without waking up at 3 a.m. to stare at the ceiling and worry about my future. My appetite returned. My concentration at work sharpened. Even my coworkers commented on how much better I looked. But I also found it increasingly difficult to leave the apartment in the evenings. Why go out to bars or restaurants when I could stay home and lie on the breathing carpet, feeling cared for and comforted in a way I'd never experienced before? I started working from home more frequently, setting up my laptop on the coffee table so I could keep one foot in contact with the carpet throughout the day. The breathing was less noticeable during daylight hours, but I could still feel a gentle warmth and the faintest hint of movement if I paid attention. Friends invited me out for drinks or dinner, and I found myself declining more often than not. Why venture into the cold, noisy world when I had everything I needed right here? The carpet seemed to understand me in ways that other people didn't. It asked nothing of me except my presence, offered nothing but comfort and peace. It was during the 3rd week of December that I first noticed the depression in the floorboard. I was vacuuming around the edges of the carpet when I saw it, a slight dip in the hardwood floor, maybe 6 inches across, directly beneath the spot where the breathing had first appeared. I lifted the corner of the carpet to get a better look. The depression was perfectly round and smooth, as if something heavy had been resting there for a very long time. The wood wasn't damaged exactly, but it had been compressed, formed into a shallow bowl shape that mirrored the rise and fall I'd been watching for weeks. I ran my fingers along the curved surface. It was warm to the touch, warmer than the surrounding floor, and I could feel a faint vibration, not quite movement, but the suggestion of movement, like standing near a large machine that was running very quietly. That night, I lay directly over the depression, my back pressed against the carpet, feeling the breathing motion more intensely than ever before. It was as if whatever was beneath the floor had grown stronger, more present, feeding on my attention and proximity. I dreamed of roots that night, thick, woody tendrils spreading beneath the building, connecting all the apartments in a vast underground network. I saw other carpets in other homes, other people lying peacefully above other depressions, all of us connected by the same breathing rhythm, the same warm pulse of life. When I woke, I was still lying on the carpet, and it was nearly noon. I'd slept for almost 14 hours, the longest, deepest sleep of my adult life. I called in sick to work and spent the day researching the carpet's history. The shop where I'd bought it had closed down, but I found the owner's phone number through business records. When I called, he seemed nervous, reluctant to talk. "That carpet," he said when I described it. "You should not have bought that carpet." "Why? What's wrong with it?" A long pause. Some things, they collect what people give them. Love, sadness, dreams, fears. This carpet, it was in a house where someone died. Someone who was very lonely, very sad, for many years before they died. What kind of someone? Old woman. She lived alone, no family, no friends. Just her and that carpet. She would lie on it every night, talking to it like it was alive. When they found her, she had been dead for 3 weeks, still lying on the carpet. My blood ran cold. What happened to her? Natural causes, they said. But I think she gave so much of herself to that carpet. There was nothing left for her own body. I hung up the phone and stared at the carpet. In the afternoon light, it looked beautiful and innocent, its golden patterns gleaming warmly. But I couldn't shake the image of an old woman lying there night after night, pouring her loneliness and need for connection into the fibers, until it became something more than fabric and wool. That evening, I tried to stay away from it. I sat on the couch instead of my usual chair, pointedly facing away from the living room. But I could feel it behind me, the gentle rhythm of breathing, the warm invitation to come closer, to lie down and be comforted. By 10 p.m., I couldn't resist any longer. I lowered myself onto the carpet and immediately felt the familiar sense of peace wash over me. The breathing was stronger than ever, more synchronized, as if it had been waiting for me to return. I told myself I would just lie there for a few minutes, then go to bed. But when I next became aware of my surroundings, pale winter sunlight was streaming through the windows, and I realized I'd spent another entire night on the carpet. This pattern continued for days. No matter how firmly I resolved to sleep in my own bed, I always ended up on the carpet, lulled drawn by its warmth and the sense of not being alone. My dreams grew more vivid, always featuring the underground network of roots, the connection between isolated people and their breathing companions. Sometimes, in these dreams, I would see the old woman who had owned the carpet before me. She was small and frail, with kind eyes and arthritic hands that she would press against the carpet's surface, as if feeling for a pulse. She never spoke, but she would nod at me with a sad smile, as if welcoming me to some exclusive club of the lonely and forgotten. I began to understand that the carpet wasn't malevolent. It was trying to help in its own way. It had learned to provide comfort from the old woman. He had absorbed her desperate need for companionship and transformed it into something that could be shared. The breathing wasn't sinister, it was empathetic, a response to human loneliness, an attempt to provide the presence that we all crave. But understanding didn't make it easier to resist. If anything, knowing the carpet's benevolent intentions made it harder to pull away. Here was something that wanted nothing more than to ease my solitude, to provide the comfort that Sarah's departure had taken away. As December wore on, I found it increasingly difficult to function during the day. Work became an abstract concept, something other people did in a world that felt increasingly distant and irrelevant. My refrigerator emptied without being refilled. Mail piled up unopened. Friends stopped calling after their messages went unreturned. The depression in the floorboard grew deeper and wider. And now I could see similar depressions forming in other spots beneath the carpet. It was as if my presence was gradually reshaping the very foundation of the room, creating a landscape of comfort that was perfectly molded to my body. I began to wonder if this was how it had been for the old woman, a gradual surrender to the carpet's embrace, a willing descent into a world where human needs were perfectly met by something that wasn't quite human but understood humanity better than most humans did. On Christmas Eve, I lay on the carpet and felt the breathing slow and deepen, matching my own respiratory rhythm so perfectly that it became impossible to tell where I ended and the carpet began. The warmth surrounded me completely now, not just rising from below, but enveloping me like a living blanket. I thought about calling someone, my sister, maybe, or one of the friends I'd been avoiding. But what would I tell them? That I'd found perfect contentment in my living room floor. That I'd discovered a form of companionship that asked nothing of me except my presence. They would want to rescue me, to pull me back into a world of obligations and disappointments, and the constant struggle to connect with people who could never really understand what I needed. They wouldn't recognize that I'd found something rare and precious, a relationship without demands, without the possibility of rejection or abandonment. The carpet would never leave me. It would never find someone better. Never grow bored with my company. Never ask me to change or improve, or become something other than what I was. It offered pure acceptance, unconditional presence, eternal comfort. As I drifted off to sleep that Christmas Eve, I felt the carpet's breathing slow even further, becoming so gentle and subtle that it was barely distinguishable from the natural settling of an old building. But I knew it was there, the steady rhythm of a companion who would never abandon me, never grow tired of providing the warmth and presence I needed. When I wake tomorrow, I know I will try once more to resist the carpet's embrace. I will shower and make coffee and pretend that I can return to the world of schedules and responsibilities. I will tell myself that what I'm experiencing isn't real, that carpets don't breathe, that I'm simply projecting my needs onto an inanimate object. But even as I make these resolutions, I can feel the carpet's gentle rhythm beneath me, patient and persistent. It knows, as I know, that resistance is temporary. The loneliness that drove me to it in the first place hasn't gone away. It's only been temporarily soothed by this strange, impossible comfort. In my dreams, the old woman sits beside me on the carpet, and we breathe together in perfect synchronization, 3 hearts beating as one, 3 sets of lungs drawing air in the same rhythm. She reaches out with one arthritis, gnarled hand, and takes mine. And I understand that she never really died. She simply found a different way of being, a form of existence that doesn't require the constant struggle of maintaining a separate body, a distinct identity. The carpet sighs beneath us, a sound like wind through autumn leaves, and I feel myself sinking deeper into its warm embrace. Outside, snow begins to fall against the windows, but here in this cocoon of burgundy and gold, I am perfectly warm, perfectly safe, perfectly understood. The breathing continues, slow and steady and eternal, and I let myself match its rhythm completely, feeling my boundaries dissolve until I can no longer tell where Sarah's ex-boyfriend ends and the carpet's dreams begin. This is not death, I realize. This is transformation. This is finding the companionship I've always needed in a form I never expected. The last thing I remember, before sleep takes me completely, is the feeling of roots spreading beneath the floorboards, connecting me to all the other lonely souls who have found solace in the breathing of impossible things. We are not lost. We are not alone. We are simply learning new ways to exist, new forms of love that don't require two separate hearts to sustain them. The carpet breathes, and I breathe with it, and in that perfect synchronization, I find a peace that no human relationship has ever been able to provide. Story 4. The advertisement appeared in my morning newspaper like a whispered secret. Tucked between the obituaries and classified ads where desperate people peddle their last possessions. Shadows wanted. It read in elegant serif font. Exceptional compensation for unique specimens. Serious inquiries only Mr. Blackwood Antiquities and Curiosities. I should have turned the page. Should have sipped my coffee and forgotten about the strange little notice that seemed to shimmer slightly in the morning light filtering through my kitchen window. But my bank account was hemorrhaging money faster than I could earn it. And desperation has a way of making the impossible seem merely improbable. The address led me to a narrow townhouse, squeezed between a shuttered bakery and a shop that sold nothing but vintage clocks. The building seemed to lean inward, as if listening to secrets whispered on the street below. Gothic revival architecture with windows that reflected nothing, not even my approaching figure. I knocked 3 times, the sound swallowed by the heavy oak door. When it opened, I found myself face to face with a man who looked as if he'd stepped from a daguerreotype. Tall and angular, with silver hair combed back in precise waves and eyes the color of old pewter. His suit was immaculate, pressed with military precision, yet somehow seemed to belong to another century. Mr. Blackwood, I asked, though I knew it had to be him. He possessed the peculiar magnetism of someone who had gazed too long into dark corners of the world. Indeed. And you must be here about the advertisement. His voice carried the faint trace of an accent I couldn't place. Something European, refined, aged like expensive wine. Please, do come in. Mind the step. The interior defied the narrow exterior. Rooms stretched impossibly deep, lined with glass cases containing objects that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. I glimpsed what appeared to be bottled moonbeams, pressed flowers that shifted color as I watched, and books whose pages turned themselves when no one was looking. An impressive collection, I murmured, trying to sound nonchalant while my eyes catalogued impossibilities. Each piece tells a story, Blackwood replied, leading me through corridors that seemed to rearrange themselves when I wasn't paying attention. But stories, I've found, are far less interesting than the shadows they cast. Shadows hold the truth of things, the essence that remains when all pretense is stripped away. We arrived at a circular room dominated by an ornate mirror that reflected not our images, but something darker, more substantial. The shadows in the reflection moved independently of our bodies, stretching and contracting like living things taking deep breaths. You collect shadows, I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. I preserve them. Shadows are the most honest part of any person. They cannot lie, cannot pretend to be other than what they are. They are pure truth. unfiltered by consciousness or social convention. He gestured toward the mirror. "Would you like to see yours?" Before I could answer, he adjusted something on the mirror's ornate frame. My reflection shimmered and dissolved, replaced by my shadow. But this shadow was wrong. It moved with predatory grace, its proportions subtly different from mine. Its head tilted at an angle that would have snapped my neck, and its fingers ended in points that looked sharp enough to cut glass. Everyone's shadow is unique. Blackwood continued conversationally, as if discussing the weather rather than showing me something that violated the basic laws of physics. Some are timid, clinging close to their owners. Others are bold, stretching far beyond what should be possible. But yours, he paused, studying the mirror with professional interest. Yours is particularly magnificent. It has appetite. I wanted to look away from the mirror, but my shadow held my gaze with hypnotic intensity. It raised one elongated hand and pressed it against the glass from the inside. I felt pressure against my palm, though my hand hung loose at my side. "How is this possible?" I whispered. "The better question is, what is possible when you understand the true nature of shadows?" Blackwood moved behind me, his presence both comforting and deeply unsettling. Shadows are not mere absence of light. They are repositories of potential. They hold all the things we might have been, all the choices we didn't make, all the desires we suppress in daylight. My shadow in the mirror smiled, and I felt my own lips curve upward without conscious intention. "The compensation," I managed to say, though part of me no longer cared about money. "You mentioned exceptional compensation." $50,000, Blackwood said simply. "For full ownership rights to your shadow. It would remain with you, of course. One cannot survive without one's shadow for very long. But it would belong to me. I would be able to call upon it when needed." "Call upon it for what?" "Errands. Small tasks that require someone with your particular attributes. Nothing harmful, I assure you. Think of it as a very exclusive consulting arrangement." The shadow in the mirror nodded enthusiastically, as if it were eager for employment. I felt a strange sense of betrayal. My own shadow was negotiating against me. "I need time to think," I said, though the words felt hollow. Some part of me had already decided. Some deep part that resonated with the shadow's enthusiasm for whatever dark errands Blackwood had in mind. "Of course, but don't take too long. Shadows grow restless when kept waiting, and yours is already quite eager." He handed me an ornate business card that felt warm to the touch. "You have until midnight tomorrow to decide. After that, I'll have to find another candidate." I left the townhouse feeling as if I were walking slightly out of step with myself, as though my shadow and I were no longer perfectly synchronized. The business card pulsed gently in my pocket like a sleeping heart. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my shadow moving independently in the mirror, pressing its hands against the glass from the inside, mouthing words I couldn't hear, but somehow understood. It was lonely in there, trapped behind silvered glass, and it wanted out. The next day crawled by with dreamlike sluggishness. I found myself checking mirrors compulsively, looking for signs that my shadow was misbehaving. At work, my colleagues kept glancing at me oddly, as if something about my appearance was subtly wrong. Sarah from accounting mentioned that I looked different somehow, sharper around the edges. "Are you feeling all right?" she asked, her eyes not quite meeting mine. "You look like you're standing in your own shadow." I laughed, but the sound came out hollow and strange. When I looked down, I realized she was right. My shadow fell in the wrong direction, stretching toward the fluorescent lights overhead instead of away from them. I moved my desk lamp to cast a more conventional shadow, but it felt like putting on an uncomfortable disguise. By evening, I knew I would return to Blackwood's townhouse. The decision had made itself while I wasn't paying attention, emerging from some deeper part of my psyche, where logical thought held no sway. I told myself it was about the money, but money had nothing to do with the anticipation thrumming in my veins. The townhouse looked different at night, its windows glowing with warm amber light that seemed to come from no identifiable source. The door opened before I could knock, and Blackwood stood silhouetted against the golden interior. "I knew you would return," he said, stepping aside to let me enter. "Your shadow has been quite animated today. I could feel it from here, pulling against its moorings like a ship eager to leave harbor." We walked through corridors that seemed more labyrinthine than before, past display cases filled with objects that defied categorization. I glimpsed what appeared to be crystallized laughter, bottled sighs, and pressed flowers that bloomed and withered in endless cycles. "The collection grows constantly," Blackwood explained, noticing my fascination. "Each acquisition brings new possibilities, new understanding of the spaces between what is and what could be." The circular room looked exactly as I remembered, except that the mirror now showed dozens of shadows milling about behind the glass, like guests at a cocktail party. Some paced restlessly, others seemed to be engaged in conversation, and a few pressed their faces against the glass with desperate intensity. "Previous clients," Blackwood explained casually. "They're quite social once you get to know them. Shadows enjoy each other's company far more than their owners ever did." My shadow detached itself from the crowd and approached the mirror's surface. It waved at me cheerfully, then held up what appeared to be a contract, written in flowing script that shifted and changed as I tried to read it. "Standard agreement," Blackwood assured me. "Full ownership transfer in exchange for compensation and certain considerations. Your shadow will be well cared for, I promise, and you'll find the arrangement quite liberating." He handed me an antique fountain pen that felt heavier than it should. The contract materialized on an elegant writing desk that I was certain hadn't been there moments before. The terms were written in elaborate calligraphy that seemed to move slightly in my peripheral vision. But the meaning was clear enough: $50,000 for full rights to my shadow, with the understanding that it might be called upon for unspecified services. What kind of services? I asked, though my hand was already moving toward the signature line. Oh, the usual: reconnaissance, message delivery. Occasionally, more specialized tasks that require someone with fewer constraints than the typical person. Blackwood smiled, and for a moment his own shadow seemed to smile back from an impossible angle. Shadows can go places and do things that their owners cannot. They're remarkably versatile. I signed my name with a flourish, and the contract burst into flames that cast no heat. The ash scattered and reformed into a check written on heavy parchment that felt ancient beneath my fingers. "Excellent," Blackwood said, clapping his hands together. "The transfer will take a few hours to complete. You may experience some adjustment symptoms. Nothing to worry about. A sense of lightness, perhaps. Occasional double vision. The feeling that you're being watched by yourself." As if on cue, I felt a strange pulling sensation, as if someone were gently tugging at my clothes from the inside. In the mirror, my shadow had stepped away from the glass and was shaking hands with Blackwood's reflection. They appeared to be discussing something in earnest, gesturing toward me occasionally, like parents planning a child's future. "It's done, then?" I asked, though I could already feel the change taking place. The world looked subtly different, as if I were viewing it through polarized sunglasses that filtered out some essential quality of light. "The beginning has begun," Blackwood replied cryptically. You'll find that life without full ownership of one's shadow is quite different from what you're used to. More flexible, less constrained by conventional rules of physics and social expectation. I left the townhouse feeling lighter than air, as if gravity had loosened its grip on me. The check in my pocket felt heavier than my entire body, and my reflection in store windows looked somehow incomplete, like a photograph with the contrast turned too high. The money cleared my account the next morning, arriving via electronic transfer from an institution I'd never heard of, the First Umbral Bank of London. The funds were real enough, allowing me to pay off my debts and purchase luxuries I'd only dreamed of. But the cost began revealing itself in small, unsettling ways. My shadow fell in wrong directions now, sometimes stretching toward the sun instead of away from it. In crowded places, people unconsciously stepped aside to let me pass, their eyes sliding away from me as if I were somehow difficult to perceive directly. And sometimes, late at night, I caught glimpses of my shadow moving independently, reaching for objects I hadn't touched, gesturing to people who weren't there, conducting conversations in a language of pure darkness. I tried calling Blackwood, but the townhouse had vanished from the narrow street where it had stood, leaving only a gap between buildings that no one else seemed to notice. The phone number on his business card connected to a recording that played the sound of wind through through empty rooms. 3 weeks later, I received my first assignment. Not a phone call or letter, but a message delivered by my own shadow, which had apparently learned to write. I found the note pressed against my bathroom mirror. When I woke up, written in handwriting that was almost, but not quite my own, tonight. The Museum of Natural History, 3rd floor, Hall of Minerals. Retrieve the meteorite fragment from the display case marked Gifts from the Void. Leave it in the rose garden behind the library. Tell no one. B. I should have refused. Should have ignored the message and gone about my normal day. But my shadow had other plans. It moved with purpose now, pulling me through my morning routine with mechanical efficiency. When I tried to resist, to assert my own will over my body's movements, I felt a strange, doubling sensation, as if I were watching myself from a great distance. The museum job was easier than it should have been. Security cameras seemed to look right through me, and locked doors opened at my approach. I moved through the darkened halls like smoke, my shadow stretching ahead of me to scout the way. The meteorite fragment was exactly where the note said it would be, sitting in its climate-controlled case like a piece of captured starlight. When I touched the glass, it simply dissolved, reforming after I'd taken what I came for. The fragment felt warm in my pocket, humming with energy that made my teeth ache and my shadow dance with excitement. I left the meteorite in the rose garden as instructed, burying it beneath a bush that seemed to lean away from the alien stone. By morning, it was gone, and the roses in that section of the garden had bloomed out of season, their petals black as midnight and soft as velvet. The assignments came more frequently after that, always at night, always delivered by my shadow's spidery handwriting on mirrors and windows. I stole impossible things from improbable places. A vial of distilled moonlight from an observatory, a pressed flower from a garden that existed only in dreams, a photograph that showed the viewer's death. Each theft was effortless, accomplished with a fluidity that belonged more to dream than reality. I tried to research Blackwood, to understand what I had become part of, but every search led to dead ends. The few references I found were fragmentary, mentions in occult texts of a collector who preserved shadows, stories whispered in online forums about people who had sold parts of themselves for money they couldn't spend. The money, I realized, was becoming increasingly useless. Not because it wasn't real. My bank account showed a healthy balance, but because I found myself needing less and less of the material world. Food had lost its taste. Sleep brought dreams of moving through darkened museums and moonlit gardens, and human contact felt increasingly foreign. My reflection showed a person who looked like me, but wasn't quite me, as if I were a high-quality copy that had lost some essential detail in translation. Friends stopped calling, not through any conscious decision, but because conversations with me had become unsatisfying in ways they couldn't articulate. I was present but not present, there but not there. 3 months after signing the contract. I realized I had become something like Blackwood himself, a collector of experiences that belonged to someone else, a curator of moments stolen from the spaces between seconds. My apartment filled with objects that shouldn't exist, paintings that show different scenes depending on the viewer's mood, books written in languages that predated human speech, mirrors that reflected rooms I had never seen. The final assignment came on a night when the moon hung like a silver coin in the velvet sky. This time, the message appeared not on a mirror, but in the shadows on my wall, words formed by the absence of light. Come home. Time to join the collection. B. I found the townhouse exactly where it had always been, as if it had never left. Blackwood waited in the doorway, unchanged, except for a new acquisition in his lapel. A shadow, flower that bloomed and closed in rhythm with his breathing. You've done excellent work, he said, leading me through corridors that now felt familiar as childhood memories. Your shadow has proven remarkably adaptable. It's time for the next phase of our arrangement, which is full integration. You've been operating as a free agent, but shadows work best when they're part of a larger collection. Community, if you will. Your shadow has been lonely, working solo. It craves the company of its own kind. We reached the circular room, where the mirror now showed dozens of shadows engaged in what appeared to be a celebration. They waved when they saw me, gesturing for me to join them behind the glass. I'll die if I give up my shadow completely, I said, though the prospect didn't frighten me as much as it should have. D is such a limited word. Blackwood mused. Transform is more accurate. Evolve. Become something more than the sum of your parts. He gestured toward the mirror. Look at them. Do they seem dead to you? They seem more alive than most people I encounter in the daylight world. The shadows in the mirror were indeed animated with an energy that felt enviable. They moved with purpose and joy, free from the physical constraints that had always limited me. When I looked closer, I recognized some of them, the woman who had worked at the coffee shop near my apartment, the man who had sat next to me on the bus every morning, the teenager who had delivered my groceries. They all chose this. I asked. Eventually. Some took longer to understand the benefits of the arrangement, but shadows are patient. They wait until their owners are ready to let go of the illusion of individual existence. My own shadow stepped forward in the mirror and placed its palm against the glass. I felt the pressure against my corresponding palm, along with something else, a profound sense of coming home after a long journey through foreign territory. The choice is yours, Blackwood said, though his tone suggested the outcome was already decided. Butte, I should mention that your shadow has been making its own arrangements. It's grown rather fond of its independence, as if to demonstrate. My shadow detached itself from my feet and walked around me in a slow circle, examining me from angles that should have been impossible. It paused in front of me and tapped the glass. then pointed toward the other shadows with obvious longing. I understood then that the choice had never really been mine. From the moment I answered that advertisement, from the moment I felt desperate enough to sell something as essential as my own shadow. I had been walking a path that led inevitably to this room, this mirror, this moment of transition. Will it hurt? I asked. Quite the opposite. Blackwood assured me. You'll feel lighter than you ever have, free from the weight of physical existence, free from the burden of individual consciousness. You'll be part of something larger, more connected than you can currently imagine. I placed my hand against the mirror's surface and felt it give way like warm water. The glass rippled around my fingers, and my shadow reached through from the other side to grasp my hand. Its touch was cool and familiar, like shaking hands with myself. The transition was gradual and surprisingly gentle. I felt myself becoming insubstantial, my edges blurring until I couldn't tell where I ended and the darkness began. The last thing I saw with physical eyes was Blackwood's satisfied smile and his own shadow giving me a welcoming wave. Now I exist behind the mirror, part of Blackwood's collection, but not trapped by it. We are his agents in the spaces between light and darkness, moving through the world on errands that serve purposes beyond human comprehension. Sometimes I remember being corporeal, having weight and substance and individual thoughts. But those memories feel like dreams from someone else's life. The other shadows are good company. We share a bond deeper than friendship, a connection that transcends the loneliness that plagued our individual existences. We move as one when called upon, think as one when contemplation is required, and rest as one in the quiet hours when the world sleeps. And sometimes, when the moon is new and the darkness is deep, we dance. Blackwood still places advertisements in newspapers, still receives visitors who arrive clutching business cards and desperate hope. We watch through the mirror as new candidates sign contracts with fountain pens that weigh more than their souls. Each addition to the collection brings fresh perspective, new capabilities, expanded possibilities. The work continues. The collection grows. And somewhere in the city, another person is reading an advertisement that promises exceptional compensation for something they never realized they could sell. They will find the townhouse. They will meet Blackwood. They will look into the mirror and see their shadow waving back. And eventually, they will come home. The advertisements appear like whispered secrets, tucked between obituaries and classifieds where desperate people peddle their last possessions. Shadows wanted. They read in elegant serif font. Exceptional compensation for unique specimens. Serious inquiries only. And we are always waiting behind the glass, ready to welcome the next member of our ever-growing family. Story 5. The rain drummed against the bus stop shelter with a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. Each drop finding its way through the gaps in the plastic roof to land on my shoulders. I pulled my jacket tighter and checked my watch for the third time in 5 minutes. Levinson 47 p.m. The last bus of the night should arrive any moment now. When the headlights finally cut through the darkness, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The Route 23 pulled up with a hydraulic sigh, its doors folding open with mechanical precision. The interior was bathed in that familiar harsh fluorescent light that made everything look slightly unreal, slightly sickly. Evening, I mumbled to the driver as I fumbled for my transit card. He was an older man with deep, set eyes that seemed to look right through me. He nodded wordlessly, and I made my way down the narrow aisle. The bus was surprisingly full for such a late hour. Most of the passengers sat alone, staring out the rain-streaked windows or down at their phones. A woman in a red coat occupied the seat behind the driver, her fingers drumming silently against her purse. Across from her, a teenager with earbuds bobbed his head to music I couldn't hear. Further back, an elderly man in a worn tweed jacket clutched a briefcase on his lap, his knuckles white against the dark leather. I found an empty seat about halfway down and settled in, grateful to be out of the rain. The bus lurched forward, and I watched the familiar streets of my neighborhood slide past the window. Oak Street, Maple Avenue, the old library with its Gothic spires reaching up into the darkness. Normal, comforting, home. As we rounded the corner onto Elm Street, something felt off. I couldn't quite place it at first, just a nagging sensation that something wasn't right. The streetlights cast the same amber glow they always did, and the houses looked exactly as they should. Yet there was something about the quality of the light, the way the shadows fell, that made everything seem slightly wrong. I shook my head, attributing the feeling to fatigue. It had been a long day at work, followed by an even longer evening at my mother's house, helping her sort through decades of accumulated belongings. My eyes felt heavy, and I let them drift closed as the gentle swaying of the bus began to lull me toward sleep. When I opened them again, we were passing the old library, the same Gothic spires, the same weathered stone facade. I blinked, confused. Hadn't we already passed this? I must have dozed off and lost track of where we were. The Route 23 made several loops through the downtown area before heading out to the suburbs where I lived. I settled back in my seat and tried to relax. But 15 minutes later, we passed the library again. This time I was fully alert, watching carefully. Same building, same angle, same everything. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain outside. I looked around at the other passengers, expecting to see confusion or concern on their faces, but they all seemed perfectly content. The woman in the red coat continued her silent drumming. The teenager bobbed his head to his inaudible music. The elderly man stared straight ahead, his grip never loosening on his briefcase. I pulled out my phone and opened the transit app. According to the GPS, we were nowhere. The little blue dot that should have shown our location was absent, and the map showed only a blank gray space. No error message, no location unavailable, warning, just emptiness. "Excuse me," I called out to the driver. How much longer until we reach Riverside Avenue? He didn't respond. The woman in the red coat turned to look at me, and for a moment I thought she might answer instead. But she just stared, her dark eyes reflecting the fluorescent lights like pools of oil. After a long moment, she turned back toward the front of the bus. We passed the library a third time. I stood up, my legs unsteady as the bus swayed around a familiar corner. "Driver," I said more loudly. "Driver, I think we're going in circles." Still no response. The other passengers didn't even look up. It was as if I hadn't spoken at all. Panic began to creep up my spine like cold fingers. I stumbled down the aisle toward the front of the bus, grabbing seat backs for support. "Hey!" I shouted. "Something's wrong here." The driver's eyes met mine in the rearview mirror. They were the same deep, set eyes I'd noticed when I boarded, but now they seemed infinitely deeper, as if I were looking into wells that had no bottom. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made my blood run cold. Next stop, Oak Street, came the automated announcement, though I could see through the window that we were nowhere near Oak Street. We were passing the library again, its spires cutting through the night sky like accusing fingers. I reached for the stop request button, pressing it frantically. The yellow "Stop requested" sign lit up, but the bus didn't slow down. If anything, it seemed to accelerate, the familiar streets blurring past the windows. "Let me off," I demanded, but my voice sounded weak and distant. As if it were being swallowed by the ambient hum of the engine and the whisper of tires on wet asphalt. The woman in the red coat turned to look at me again, and this time she spoke. "You can't get off," she said, her voice perfectly calm and reasonable. "No one gets off." "What do you mean?" I asked, but she had already turned away. I looked around at the other passengers with new eyes. The teenager was still bobbing his head, but now I realized his earbuds weren't connected to anything. The cord dangled loose beside his seat. The elderly man's briefcase, which he clutched so protectively, was covered in a thin layer of dust, as if it hadn't been moved in years. And their eyes, when I looked closely, really looked, I could see that their eyes had the same infinite depth as the driver's, dark wells that seemed to go on forever. How long had they been riding this bus? I stumbled back to my seat, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a dream, or some kind of breakdown brought on by stress and exhaustion. But the vinyl seat felt real under my hands, and I could smell the familiar bus scents of diesel fuel and cleaning solution and the faint odor of wet umbrellas. The library passed by the window again. I closed my eyes and tried to think rationally. There had to be an explanation. Maybe the driver was new and didn't know the route. Maybe there was construction somewhere that was forcing us to detour. Maybe my fatigue was making me paranoid and confused. But when I opened my eyes, the elderly man was looking at me. His face was kind, grandfatherly, but his eyes held that same bottomless quality. "First night?" he asked in a voice like rustling leaves. What? First night on the road, he clarified. It takes some getting used to. I don't understand, I said. Though part of me was beginning to, he smiled sadly. You will. We all did, eventually. How long have you been riding this bus? He considered the question, tilting his head slightly. Time works differently here, he said finally. Days blend into nights and nights into days. But I remember getting on. It was raining then, too. I looked out the window. The library was approaching again, its familiar silhouette unchanged. But as we drew closer, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There were people inside, moving through the lit windows. But it was nearly midnight. The library should have been closed hours ago. Who are they? I asked, pointing. The elderly man followed my gaze. The ones who never left, he said simply. As we passed the library, I saw them more clearly. Figures in outdated clothing, wandering the stacks, pulling books from shelves and replacing them in an endless cycle. A woman in a 1940s dress sat at one of the reading tables, turning the pages of a book that appeared to be blank. A man in a Victorian-era suit stood by the card catalogue, methodically opening and closing drawers. Every building on the route has them. The elderly man continued conversationally. The ones who stayed too long in one place, who forgot that they were supposed to leave, were more fortunate in a way. At least we keep moving. But why? I asked. What is this place? A loop, said the woman in the red coat, turning around again. A circuit. A wheel that turns but never advances. I want to get off, I said, hating how small my voice sounded. We all did. At first. The teenager said, speaking for the first time. His voice was older than his face suggested, weathered by time and resignation. But you learn to appreciate the constancy, the certainty. Outside is chaos, jobs and bills and relationships, and all the messy complications of living. Here, there's only the route. But this isn't living, I protested. Isn't it? Asked the driver, his voice carrying clearly from the front of the bus despite the engine noise. You're breathing. Your heart is beating. You're experiencing sensations, having thoughts, feeling emotions. What else is living but the continuation of consciousness through time? The bus turned another corner, and I knew without looking that we were approaching the library again. The pattern was becoming as familiar as breathing the approach, the passing, the gradual curve back into the beginning of the loop. Oak Street, Maple Avenue, Elm Street, the library, repeat. How many times? I asked no one in particular. Does it matter? Replied the woman in the red coat. Once you stop counting, it becomes quite peaceful. I tried to remember what I had been doing before I got on the bus. I'd been at my mother's house. That much I could recall. We'd been going through old photo albums, sorting them into boxes. She'd been telling me stories about pictures I'd never seen before, relatives I'd never met, places the family had lived before I was born. But now, trying to hold on to those memories, they seemed to slip away like water through my fingers. Had it been tonight? Last week? The details grew fuzzy, uncertain. The library passed by again. I found myself settling back into my seat, the initial panic giving way to a strange kind of numbness. The other passengers were right. There was something oddly comforting about the repetition. No decisions to make, no choices to agonize over, no uncertainty about what came next. Just the gentle sway of the bus, the steady rhythm of the wheels on the road, the soft hum of conversation from the other passengers who had long since made peace with their situation. What happens if I just stay? I asked. Nothing, said the elderly man. Everything. You become part of the road, and the route becomes part of you. Through the window, I watched the familiar streets roll by. A 24-hour diner with its neon sign flickering in the rain inside. I could see the same waitress serving the same customer the same cup of coffee. She'd been serving for who knew how long. A gas station where the attendant stood motionless behind the counter, his eyes reflecting the fluorescent lights. An apartment building where lights in various windows turned on and off in the same sequence, over and over. Are they happy? I asked, watching a woman in one of the apartment windows water the same plant for the 1,000th time. Happiness is a choice, the driver said. Here, like anywhere else. The bus slowed slightly as we approached a red light that I knew would turn green just as we reached it. It always did. In that moment of deceleration, I felt something shift inside me. The desperate need to escape, to return to my normal life, began to fade like morning mist. What was my normal life, anyway? A job that left me feeling empty and unfulfilled. A small apartment where I spent most evenings alone, scrolling through social media and watching other people live their lives. Bills that never seemed to get paid down, despite my best efforts. The slow, creeping realization that I was getting older without ever having really figured out what I wanted from life. Here, on the Route 23, there were no bills, no performance reviews or awkward small talk with coworkers, no endless parade of dating app profiles and disappointing first dates. No pressure to have opinions about politics or the latest scandal or what was trending on social media. Just the rote. Just the gentle, predictable rhythm of the wheels and the soft murmur of rain against the windows. The first loop is always the hardest. The woman in the red coat said gently. But it gets easier. I looked at her more closely. Under the harsh fluorescent light, I could see that she was younger than I'd initially thought. Maybe in her 30s, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Her red coat was well made, expensive looking. The sort of thing someone might wear to an important business meeting or a first date with someone special. What were you doing when you got on the bus? I asked her. She considered the question for a moment. I was running away from something, she said finally. Or towards something. It's hard to remember which. Do you miss it? Whatever it was. Less and less, she admitted. Memory is like that. It fades when you don't use it. And here, we don't need to remember. We just need to be The teenager nodded in agreement. The past is just stories we tell ourselves anyway. And the future is just anxiety about things that might never happen. This is the only real moment, this bus, this seat, this conversation. Through the window, the library was approaching again. But this time, instead of filling me with dread, the sight brought a strange comfort. Constancy, reliability, the knowledge that no matter what happened, the library would be there. Its windows glowing warmly in the darkness, its inhabitants pursuing their eternal routines. I found myself wondering if this was how fish felt in an aquarium contained. Yes, but also safe, protected from predators, provided for, free to swim in gentle circles, without ever having to worry about where their next meal would come from, or whether they'd survive another day in the wild. Is this what you wanted? I asked the bus itself, speaking to whatever force or entity had created this endless loop. Passengers who don't fight the road anymore. At once what all systems want, the driver replied. To perpetuate itself, to continue existing. We are its components, its moving parts. It feeds on our movement, our energy, our acceptance. And in return, peace, said the elderly man. Freedom from choice, from consequence, from the burden of an uncertain future. The bus turned another corner, beginning the familiar arc back toward Oak Street. I realized I'd stopped keeping track of how many times we'd completed the circuit. 10, 20. It didn't matter. The number itself was just another unnecessary piece of information. Another thing to worry about in a world that no longer required worry. My phone had long since stopped working, not broken. Exactly, but irrelevant. The apps that had once commanded so much of my attention now seemed like artifacts from another life. What use was social media when your social circle consisted of these quiet, accepting fellow travelers? What use was email when there were no appointments to keep, no deadlines to meet? The woman in the red coat had begun humming softly, a melody I didn't recognize, but that somehow felt familiar, as if it had been playing in the background of my dreams for years. The teenager had closed his eyes, his head still moving gently to the rhythm of his disconnected earbuds. The elderly man continued to clutch his briefcase, but now his grip seemed less desperate, more ritualistic. We were all finding our rhythms within the larger rhythm of the road. How will I know when I'm ready? I asked. Ready for what? The woman replied. To stop trying to get off. She smiled, and in that smile I saw years of accumulated peace. You'll know because you'll stop asking the question. The library passed by the window again, and this time I waved to the figures inside. A man in the Victorian suit looked up from the card catalogue and waved back, his face breaking into a smile that transcended the decades between us. We were all part of the same system, the same grand design. The ones in the library had found their stillness, while we on the bus had found our motion. Different forms of the same peace, different expressions of the same acceptance. The rain continued to fall against the windows. and I found myself listening to its rhythm, not irregular, as I'd first thought, but following a pattern that matched the turning of the wheels, the humming of the engine, the soft breathing of my fellow passengers. Everything was connected. Everything was part of the route. I settled back in my seat and closed my eyes, letting the gentle swaying of the bus rock me toward a sleep that might last hours or days or years. It didn't matter. Time had become as irrelevant as destination. The Route 23 rolled on through the night, carrying its passengers on their endless journey to nowhere, and I was finally, peacefully, home. Story 6. I never noticed the sound until I moved to the 3rd floor. My new apartment was perfect in every way that mattered to someone fresh out of graduate school with a mountain of debt and a starting salary that barely covered rent in the city. The building was pre-war, with high ceilings and thick walls that kept the neighbors' music to a tolerable whisper. My unit had hardwood floors, a kitchen window that caught morning light, and enough space for my books and the desk, where I spent my evenings working on freelance articles. The only drawback was the laundry situation. The building had no in-unit washers or dryers, just a communal laundry room in the basement. I'd discovered it during my initial tour, following Mrs. Chen, the building manager, down 2 flights of concrete steps to a low, ceilinged space lit by buzzing fluorescent tubes. 6 washing machines and 4 dryers lined the walls, their white surfaces yellowed with age and heavy use. Quarter operated. Mrs. Chen had explained, her accent making the words precise and clipped. Very reliable. Building quiet after 10 p.m. No laundry after that time, please. I'd nodded and signed the lease the same day, grateful to find anything affordable so close to the subway. The laundry schedule seemed reasonable enough. I was usually asleep by 11 anyway. For the first month, I followed the rules perfectly. I'd collect my clothes on Saturday mornings and head down to the basement with a roll of quarters and a book to pass the time during the wash and dry cycles. The laundry room was utilitarian but clean, with a small table for folding and a bulletin board covered in notices about building maintenance and reminders about proper etiquette. The other tenants were considerate. If someone's load finished and they weren't there to collect it, others would move the clothes to the folding table rather than dumping them in a pile. Lost socks and orphan shirts appeared on a shelf by the door, waiting to be claimed. There was an unspoken courtesy that made the shared space feel almost communal. It was during my 2nd month that I first heard the sound that would change everything. I woke just after midnight on a Tuesday, pulled from deep sleep by something I couldn't immediately identify. My apartment was quiet. The street outside peaceful, except for the occasional car passing by. I lay still, listening, trying to understand what had disturbed me. Then I heard it, the distant rumble of a washing machine starting its cycle. The sound was faint but unmistakable. The initial rush of water filling the tub, followed by the rhythmic churning of the agitator. I checked the digital clock beside my bed. 12:17 a.m. Someone was doing laundry after the 10 o'clock cutoff. I considered going down to check, perhaps to politely remind whichever neighbor about the building policy. But the warm cocoon of my bedsheets felt too comfortable to abandon, and confronting strangers in a basement laundry room in the middle of the night seemed like poor judgment. I made a mental note to mention it to Mrs. Chen if it happened again, and drifted back to sleep. The next night, the sound returned. Same time, just after midnight, the unmistakable rumble of a washing machine beginning its cycle. This time I was more alert when it woke me, and I listened more carefully. The rhythm was steady, mechanical, exactly what you'd expect from an old machine working through its programmed sequence. By the fourth night, I realized it was always the same machine. I'd spent enough time in that basement to distinguish between them. Each machine had its own quirks, its own particular sounds. The one I was hearing was the second from the left in the row facing the dryers. It had a slightly off, balanced spin cycle that made it vibrate more than the others. Curiosity got the better of me on Friday night, when I heard the familiar rumble at 12:23 a.m. I pulled on a robe and grabbed a flashlight from my kitchen drawer. The building's hallway lights were dimmed after midnight, and I wanted to be prepared in case the basement lights were on a timer. The stairwell was darker than I expected, my footsteps echoing off concrete walls. The air grew cooler as I descended, carrying the faint scent of detergent and fabric softener that always lingered in the building's lower levels. By the time I reached the basement door, my heart was beating faster than the simple walk warranted. I pressed my ear to the door and listened. The washing machine was definitely running. I could hear it clearly now, along with the subtle vibration that traveled through the building structure. I turned the handle slowly and peered inside. The laundry room was empty. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their harsh white glow over the familiar space. The machine I expected to see running, second from the left, sat silent and still, its lid closed, no lights indicating operation. I stepped inside, confused, and listened again. The sound was definitely coming from this room. I could hear it clearly. The steady churn of water and clothes, the occasional thump of an unbalanced load. The mechanical rhythm of a machine working through its cycle. But every single washing machine was silent. I walked along the row, checking each machine carefully. All were empty, their lids up or closed with no sign of recent use. The dryers were equally quiet, their doors hanging open to air out the drums, as was customary. There was no explanation for the sound I was hearing. I stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, trying to locate the source. The noise seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the very walls were producing the sound. It was maddening, clear and consistent, but with no visible source. After 10 minutes of searching, I gave up and returned to my apartment. The sound continued until just past 1 a.m. then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The mystery consumed my thoughts over the weekend. I researched the building's history online, looking for any information that might explain what I was experiencing. The structure was built in 1927, originally designed as luxury apartments for the city's growing professional class. It had weathered the Depression and several renovations, changing hands multiple times before being converted to its current configuration in the 1980s. Nothing I found suggested any unusual history. No tragic accidents, no mysterious disappearances, no reports of supernatural activity. It was simply an old building that had housed thousands of residents over the decades, accumulating the usual accumulation of lives lived and stories forgotten. On Monday night, I was ready. I'd positioned myself in the hallway outside my apartment at 11:45, listening for the sound. At 12:19, it began. The familiar rumble of the phantom washing machine. This time, I was downstairs within 2 minutes. The laundry room looked exactly as it had on Friday night. Empty machines, fluorescent lights. The persistent sound of a wash cycle that had no source. But this time, I noticed something I'd missed before. One of the machines, the second from the left, had watermarks on its sides. Thin streams that looked fresh, as if water had recently overflowed from the tub. I approached the machine cautiously and lifted the lid. The interior was bone dry, with no sign that it had been used recently. But the water marks were definitely there, visible under the harsh lighting. As I watched, confused and increasingly unsettled, another drop of water appeared at the rim of the tub and rolled down the side of the machine. I backed away quickly, my heart racing. The sound continued around me, churning, sloshing, the rhythmic operation of machinery that wasn't there. But now I could smell something else in the air. The scent of wet fabric, heavy and musty, like clothes that had been left damp too long. I left the laundry room and didn't return for 3 days, but the sound followed me anyway. Each night, just after midnight, I heard it clearly through the walls and floors of my apartment. It had become as regular as clockwork, a nightly reminder that something in the building didn't follow the normal rules. I tried wearing earplugs, playing white noise through my phone, even moving my mattress to the living room, where the sound might be less audible. Nothing worked. The phantom washing machine seemed to broadcast directly into my consciousness, impossible to block out or ignore. After a week of interrupted sleep, I decided to confront the situation directly. I began going down to the laundry room every night when the sound started, determined to understand what was happening. Each visit revealed new details that made less sense than the last. Some nights, the watermarks appeared on different machines. Some nights, I could smell different detergents in the air. Floral scents, pine, fresh chemicals, sometimes the harsh tang of bleach. Once, I found a single wet sock on the folding table, dripping steadily onto the concrete floor. It was gone by morning. I started keeping a journal, recording everything I observed. Tuesday, 12:47 a.m., sound from machine 22. watermarks on lid and sides. Strong scent of fabric softener, but sweetly artificial, like something trying to mask a more unpleasant smell. Wednesday, 12:52 a.m. Sound seems to come from machine find 4 tonight. Found quarters on the floor beneath it, wet and warm to the touch. Tried to pick them up, but they dissolved like ice when I touched them. Thursday, 13:03 a.m. Multiple machines producing sound now, like they're synchronized. The whole room feels different, warmer, more humid. Left quickly when I started hearing voices mixed in with the machine noise. The voices were what finally convinced me that this was more than just strange acoustics or building settlement. They were faint, almost lost in the mechanical noise, but definitely human. Conversations that I could almost, but not quite understand. Spoken in languages that sounded familiar, but made no sense when I tried to focus on the words. I researched the building more extensively, diving into city records and newspaper archives. What I found changed everything. In 1952, a woman named Elena Vasquez had lived in apartment 2B, directly below my current unit. According to the newspaper report I found, she had been discovered in the building's basement laundry room, apparently the victim of an accident involving one of the washing machines. The details were sparse, as was common in news reporting of that era, but the implication was that she had somehow become entangled in the machinery while it was operating. The incident occurred on a Tuesday night in October. The time of death was estimated to be just after midnight. Mrs. Vasquez had been described by neighbors as a meticulous woman who took great pride in her home and appearance. She was known for doing her laundry at unconventional hours, preferring the solitude of the basement in the late evening when other residents were asleep. The washing machine involved in the accident was described in the police report as the second unit from the left wall. It was removed from service after the incident and later replaced, but the location remained the same. I found Elena Vasquez's obituary in the newspaper's files. She had been 34 years old. Originally from Mexico, working as a seamstress for a downtown tailor shop. She had no immediate family in the city, and her funeral was attended by neighbors and co-workers who remembered her as quiet, but kind. Someone who kept to herself, but was always ready to help others with small favors. The photograph accompanying the obituary showed a woman with dark hair and serious eyes, wearing what appeared to be her best dress. She looked tired but determined, like someone who had worked hard for everything she had achieved. Armed with this information, I returned to the laundry room the next night with a different perspective. When the sound began at 12:34 a.m., I didn't try to find its source or rationalize what I was hearing. Instead, I sat on the small bench near the folding table and simply listened. The rhythm was soothing, I realized. The steady back and forth motion, the gentle gurgle of water, the occasional soft thump of clothes redistributing themselves. It was the sound of care, of someone tending to the mundane but necessary tasks that kept life orderly and clean. Mrs. Vasquez, I said softly, feeling foolish but compelled to speak. Elena. The washing machine sounds continued unchanged, but the quality of the silence around them shifted somehow. It felt less empty, more attentive. I know you're here, I continued. I know what happened to you. I'm sorry it took so long for someone to understand. The scent of fabric softener grew stronger, but now it carried undertones of something else. Vanilla and cinnamon, the warm spices of home cooking. I could almost imagine Mrs. Vasquez in her apartment above, preparing a late dinner after a long day at the tailor shop, checking the clock to see when she could slip down to the basement unnoticed. Over the following nights, I established a routine. When the phantom laundry cycle began, I would go downstairs and sit quietly in the laundry room. I didn't try to investigate or document what was happening. I simply kept Elena company during what must have been her nightly ritual, preserved somehow in the building's memory. The experience became less frightening and more poignant. I began to understand that what I was witnessing wasn't a haunting in the traditional sense. It was an echo, a moment of ordinary life that had been interrupted so suddenly that it continued to repeat, like a record with a skip that plays the same few notes over and over. Sometimes I would bring a book and read quietly while the phantom washing machine ran its cycle. Sometimes I would work on my laptop, catching up on freelance assignments in the strange midnight communion. The sounds became comforting rather than disturbing, a reminder that I wasn't the first person to call this building home, and wouldn't be the last. I started leaving small offerings. A bar of nice soap on the folding table, a packet of lavender sachets near the machines, fresh flowers from the corner market. They were always gone by morning, though I never saw them being taken. I liked to think Elena appreciated the gestures. Other tenants in the building began to mention the midnight laundry sounds, usually in passing comments during chance encounters in the hallway. Mrs. Patterson from the second floor mentioned it to Mrs. Chen, who shrugged and said old buildings made strange noises. The college students in 1A complained about it disrupting their sleep. But their lease was up in May, and they planned to move anyway. I found myself becoming protective of the mystery, defensive of Elena's continued presence. When someone suggested calling a maintenance person to check the machines, I discouraged it. When a new tenant asked about the basement noises, I deflected their questions with vague comments about pipes and heating systems. 3 months into my strange routine, something changed. I was sitting in my usual spot on the bench, reading an article I was editing for a client, when I realized the washing machine sound had stopped. Not the abrupt cessation I was accustomed to, but a gradual winding down, the way a real machine sounds when it finishes its cycle. I looked up from my laptop to see a figure standing near the machines. Translucent, barely more substantial than a shadow, but undeniably there. Elena Vasquez looked exactly as she had in the newspaper photograph, wearing a simple dress and an apron, her dark hair pinned back practically. She was folding laundry. Her movements were careful and precise, shaking out invisible garments and folding them with the skill of someone who had performed this task thousands of times. I watched, transfixed, as she worked through what must have been a full load. Shirts, pants, linens, each item receiving her full attention. When she finished, she looked directly at me for the first time. Her expression was not frightening or tragic, but simply tired. The kind of bone, deep exhaustion that comes from working too hard for too little, from carrying burdens that never seem to lighten. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, for not being afraid, for understanding. I wanted to respond, to tell her that she didn't have to keep doing laundry, that she could rest now. But before I could find the words, she began to fade. The basement fluorescent lights seemed to dim, and the familiar sounds of the building settling. Pipes cooling, wood contracting, the distant hum of electricity returned to fill the silence. I sat alone in the empty laundry room, surrounded by machines that had been quiet for several minutes now. The air still carried a faint scent of fabric softener, but it was fading quickly. That was 3 months ago. I haven't heard the midnight washing machine since that night. The building feels different now. More settled, somehow more at peace. Other tenants have stopped mentioning the basement noises, and the college students in 1A renewed their lease, claiming the building had become much quieter. I still do my laundry on Saturday mornings, but now I take time to fold my clothes carefully, with attention to detail that would have made Elena proud. I've started using a lavender, scented fabric softener, and sometimes, when the scent fills the air, I imagine I can hear an approving murmur from somewhere beyond the buzz of the fluorescent lights. The bulletin board by the door now includes a small memorial I created. A printed photograph of Elena Vasquez that I found in the city archives, along with a brief note about her life and work. Other tenants have added their own small tributes, flowers, candles, notes of gratitude for the mysterious neighbor who once shared their building. Mrs. Chen noticed the memorial during one of her monthly inspections. I expected her to remove it, to maintain the building's professional appearance. Instead, she stood before it for a long moment, reading the information I'd compiled about Elena's life. "I remember stories," she said quietly. "My predecessor mentioned a woman who died here long ago. Very sad, very alone." She touched the frame gently. "This is good. She should be remembered." The laundry room has become a different kind of space now. Tenants linger longer when doing their washing, chatting with neighbors, sharing small kindnesses. Children draw pictures and leave them on Elena's memorial. Elderly residents bring fresh flowers from their window gardens. The room that once felt purely utilitarian now carries an undercurrent of community, of lives connected across time. I often work late into the night now, but the building no longer wakes me with phantom sounds. Instead, I sometimes find myself staying up past midnight anyway. Drawn to my window that faces the street, where Alina once walked home from her job at the tailor shop. The city has changed dramatically since 1952, but the basic rhythms remain the same. People working, coming home, tending to the small rituals that make life manageable. Sometimes I wonder if Alina simply needed acknowledgement, recognition that her life had mattered even though it ended alone in a basement laundry room. Perhaps all any of us need is to be seen, to be remembered. To know that our ordinary moments of care and attention leave traces that outlast our physical presence. On quiet nights, when the building settles into its deepest sleep, I still catch the faintest scent of lavender fabric softener drifting through the halls. But it no longer feels like an interruption or a mystery to be solved. It feels like a blessing, a reminder that this building continues to shelter lives, to witness the endless human cycle of work and rest, solitude and community. I've been thinking about staying in this apartment longer than I originally planned. The rent is still reasonable, and I've grown attached to the quirks of the old building. The way the morning light falls across my kitchen table, the sound of neighbors' footsteps in the hallway, the sense of being part of something larger than myself. Alina Vasquez did her laundry here for years, maintaining her small corner of dignity and order in a world that often overlooked women like her. Now, decades later, her presence has taught me something about persistence, about the value of routine care, about the way ordinary acts of maintenance can become sacred when performed with attention and love. The phantom washing machine has been silent for months now, but I know Elena hasn't truly left. She's woven into the building's fabric, part of its history and its continuing story. Every time someone folds their laundry with extra care, every time a neighbor helps carry a heavy basket up the stairs, every time the laundry room serves as a place of unexpected connection rather than mere utility, Elena's influence continues. Late at night, as I settle into sleep, I sometimes whisper a quiet thank you to the walls around me. Thank you to Alina for teaching me that every space holds stories. Thank you to the building for preserving memories in its own mysterious way. And thank you to whatever force in the universe ensures that no act of care, however small, is ever truly forgotten. The midnight laundry cycles have ended, but the building's heart continues to beat, steady and strong, marking time for all of us who have found shelter within its walls. And in the basement, 6 washing machines and 4 dryers stand, ready to serve the next generation of residents, their surfaces clean and bright, their drums empty and waiting. But sometimes, just sometimes, when the building is very quiet and the night is very deep, you might catch the faint scent of lavender in the air, a reminder that some presences are too gentle to be called ghosts, too loving to be called hauntings, and too important to ever truly disappear. Story 7. Dr. Henley had been my family physician for as long as I could remember, even as a child. I'd found something oddly comforting about his office, the way the afternoon sunlight filtered through the dusty Venetian blinds, casting long shadows across his cluttered desk. The smell of old leather from his medical bag, mixed with the antiseptic scent that seemed to permeate every surface. The gentle tick of the grandfather clock in the corner that marked time in steady, reassuring intervals. He was an elderly man, probably in his 70s, with silver hair that he kept meticulously combed and kind eyes that seemed to see right through whatever symptoms you presented. His hands were steady despite his age, and he had a way of listening that made you feel like you were the only patient he'd ever cared about. What made Dr. Henley truly remarkable wasn't his bedside manner, though that was exceptional. It was his uncanny ability to cure things that other doctors couldn't even diagnose. The first time I really noticed it was when I was 12 years old. I'd been suffering from severe headaches for weeks, the kind that made me nauseous and sensitive to light, that kept me home from school and lying in darkened rooms. My parents had taken me to specialists, had me tested for everything from brain tumors to allergies. Nothing showed up on any of the scans or blood tests. Growing pains, one doctor had said dismissively. He'll outgrow them. But Dr. Henley took one look at me, asked me a few gentle questions about when the headaches started and what I was thinking about when they came on, and then disappeared into his back office for several minutes. When he returned, he had a small amber bottle filled with pills that looked like they'd been hand-pressed. "Take one of these twice a day," he said, his voice soft but confident. "The headaches will be gone by the end of the week." He was right. By day 3, the pain had diminished to a dull throb. By day 7, it was completely gone, and it never came back. My parents were amazed, grateful. They praised Dr. Henley's expertise, his intuitive understanding of the human body. But even at 12, I noticed something strange about those days following my cure. I couldn't remember what I'd been doing the week before the headaches started. Not clearly, anyway. There was a haziness to that period, as if someone had smeared Vaseline over the lens of my memory. Over the years, Dr. Henley continued to work his quiet miracles. When I developed a persistent cough in high school that lasted for months and defied every treatment the specialists prescribed, Dr. Henley cured it with a bitter, tasting syrup in 3 days. When I fractured my wrist in college, and it wasn't healing properly, causing constant pain that interfered with my studies, Dr. Henley gave me a series of injections that had me back to normal within a week. Each time, though, I noticed the same strange side effect. Memories would become fuzzy, indistinct. Not recent memories, those remained crystal clear. But older ones, from around the time the illness or injury had begun, would fade like photographs left in sunlight. I didn't think much about it, really. The relief from whatever ailment was troubling me was so complete, so immediate, that the minor memory gap seemed like a small price to pay. Besides, Dr. Henley had such a reputation in our small town that questioning his methods felt almost sacrilegious. He was the doctor who could cure anything, the one people drove hundreds of miles to see when other physicians had given up. It wasn't until I was 35, married to Alina, and starting to think about having children of our own, that I began to seriously consider what those memory gaps might mean. I developed a strange condition that year, a persistent tingling in my hands and feet, accompanied by episodes of dizziness and disorientation that would strike without warning. The neurologist I'd consulted had ordered extensive testing, but everything came back normal. The symptoms, however, continued to worsen. Stress, the neurologist concluded. Sometimes the body manifests psychological tension in physical ways. Have you considered therapy? But I knew it wasn't stress. The tingling felt too specific, too localized, like electricity running through my nervous system in patterns that didn't match any anxiety disorder I'd ever heard of. So I made an appointment with Dr. Henley. His office hadn't changed in all the years I'd been visiting. The same dusty blinds, the same cluttered desk, the same grandfather clock ticking away the minutes with metronomic precision. Dr. Henley himself looked exactly as he had when I was 12. Perhaps his hair was a bit whiter, his face slightly more lined, but otherwise unchanged by the passage of 2 decades. He listened patiently as I described my symptoms, nodding at intervals, making small notes in his leather-bound journal. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "This is an interesting case," he said finally. "The symptoms you're describing, they suggest a very specific type of neurological dysfunction. Quite rare, but not untreatable." "What kind of dysfunction?" He waved his hand vaguely. "The brain sometimes develops, let's call them redundancies, pathways that serve no useful purpose but consume energy and cause interference with normal function. Think of them as neurological weeds that need to be pruned away." I frowned. "I've never heard of anything like that. Most physicians haven't," Dr. Henley said with a slight smile. "It requires a very specialized approach, but I believe I can help you." He disappeared into his back office, as he always did, and I could hear him moving around, opening and closing cabinets, the soft clink of glass bottles. When he returned, he carried a small vial filled with a clear liquid that seemed to shimmer slightly when he held it up to the light. "This is a very precise treatment," he said, drawing the liquid into a syringe. "It targets only the problematic neural pathways, leaving everything else intact. You'll feel some disorientation initially, but within a few days, all your symptoms should be completely resolved." I rolled up my sleeve and let him inject the strange, shimmering liquid into my arm. It burned slightly going in, and I felt a brief moment of dizziness that passed almost immediately. "How does it work?" I asked as he disposed of the syringe. Dr. Henley paused, considering his words carefully. "Think of memory as a vast library," he said. "Sometimes certain books become corrupted, damaged in ways that interfere with the proper functioning of the whole system. This treatment simply removes those damaged volumes, allowing the healthy material to function more efficiently. You're talking about memories. In a sense, yes. The neurological dysfunction you're experiencing is tied to certain memory patterns, traumatic or stressful experiences that have created maladaptive neural pathways. By removing those specific memories, we eliminate the source of the problem. I stared at him, a cold feeling creeping up my spine. You're saying this treatment will erase some of my memories? Only the ones that are causing problems. Dr. Henley said gently. You won't even notice they're gone. In fact, you'll feel better than you have in years. I wanted to ask more questions, to understand exactly what memories he was talking about and why they were causing physical symptoms. But the injection was already taking effect. I could feel a strange loosening in my mind, as if thoughts that had been held tightly were suddenly being allowed to drift away. This is wrong, I managed to say, but my voice sounded distant and unconvincing even to myself. Trust me, Dr. Henley said, his kind eyes meeting mine. I've been doing this for a very long time. I know what's best. The next few days passed in a haze of mild confusion and disorientation, exactly as Dr. Henley had predicted. But by the end of the week, the tingling in my hands and feet was completely gone, and the dizzy spells had stopped entirely. I felt clear, headed and energetic in a way I hadn't experienced in months. There was just one problem. I couldn't remember why Alina and I had been fighting. I knew we'd been having some kind of conflict before I got sick. I could sense the shape of it, like running your tongue over the gap where a tooth used to be. But the specifics were gone. When I tried to recall what we'd been arguing about, I hit a wall of vague impressions and half-formed emotions that led nowhere. Elena seemed as confused as I was. You really don't remember? She asked when I brought it up. The whole thing with your mother, and what she said about the baby, and how upset you got. What about my mother? What about a baby? She stared at me for a long moment, then shook her head. Never mind. Maybe it's better this way. But it wasn't better. Over the following weeks, I became increasingly aware of gaps in my memory. Not just around the argument with Alina, but stretching back months or even years. There were entire conversations, events, experiences that I could sense had happened, but couldn't quite access, like trying to remember a dream upon waking. I started keeping a journal, writing down everything I could recall about recent events, trying to map the boundaries of what had been taken from me. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Every time I'd been treated by Dr. Henley, a corresponding period of my life had become inaccessible. Not just the time when I was sick, but the weeks or months leading up to each illness. The headaches when I was 12, I couldn't remember the summer before they started. The one when my parents had sent me to stay with my aunt while they worked things out. The persistent cough in high school the period around my girlfriend's pregnancy. Scare was gone. The fractured wrist in college. I'd lost all memory of the hazing incident that had led to my injury. Each treatment had targeted not just my physical symptoms, but the psychological trauma that had caused them. Doctor, Henley wasn't just curing diseases. He was editing my life, removing the difficult chapters, and leaving only the manageable ones. I made an appointment to confront him, but when I arrived at his office, I found myself strangely reluctant to challenge him directly. There was something about his presence, his gentle authority, that made questioning him feel almost impossible. "You look troubled," he said as he examined my blood pressure. "Are you experiencing any new symptoms?" "I'm having memory problems," I said carefully. "Since the last treatment." He nodded sympathetically. "That's not uncommon. Your brain is adjusting to its new, healthier patterns. The confusion should pass soon, but I can't remember things that happened before I got sick. Important things. Editar." Henley set down his stethoscope and looked at me with those kind, penetrating eyes. "Tell me, are you happy with your life right now?" The question caught me off guard. I considered it honestly. Alina and I were getting along better than we had in months. Work was going well. I felt physically healthy and emotionally stable. "Yes," I admitted. "I am. And before the treatment, were you happy then?" I tried to remember. But the emotions from that period were as inaccessible as the events themselves. I could sense that I'd been troubled, anxious, but I couldn't recall why. "I don't know," I said. "The memories I remove," Dr. Henley said gently, "are always the ones that serve no positive purpose. Traumatic experiences, painful emotions, destructive thought patterns. They're like infected tissue that spreads disease throughout the entire system. By excising them, I allow the healthy parts of your mind to flourish." "But they're my memories," I protested. "Even the bad ones. They make me who I am." Dr. Henley smiled sadly. "Do they? Or do they simply make you who you were, someone in pain? Someone struggling with burdens that were too heavy to bear?" I left that appointment more confused than ever. Over the following weeks, I tried to investigate my missing memories, talking to Alina, to my parents, to old friends, trying to piece together what had been taken from me. The picture that emerged was not pleasant. The summer, when I was 12, my parents had been on the verge of divorce. The hazing incident in college had been much worse than a simple fracture. I'd been hospitalized for internal injuries that could have killed me. The argument with Alina had been about my mother's suggestion that we might not be ready for children, that Alina's miscarriage earlier that year had been for the best. Each missing memory was a wound, a source of pain or trauma that Dr. Henley had cleanly excised from my consciousness. And looking at them objectively, I had to admit that I was better off without them. My relationship with my parents was warm and uncomplicated. I had no lasting psychological damage from my college experience. Alina and I were happy together. no longer burdened by the grief and recriminations that had followed her miscarriage. Dr. Henley had given me exactly what he'd promised, a life free from the experiences that had caused me pain. But was it still my life? I found myself visiting Dr. Henley more frequently, not because I was sick, but because I was drawn to understand how he did what he did. His office became a sanctuary, a place where difficult questions could be answered simply, where complex emotional problems could be solved with a single injection. "You're troubled again," he observed during one of these visits. "What's wrong?" "I keep thinking about the memories you've taken," I said, wondering who I might have been if I'd kept them. "Someone in pain," Dr. Henley replied without hesitation. "Someone limited by trauma, defined by suffering. Is that who you want to be? Maybe that person was more real than who I am now." Dr. Henley leaned back in his chair, studying me with those penetrating eyes. "Reality is overrated," he said finally. "What matters is function, happiness, the ability to move through life without being constantly undermined by old wounds and pointless regrets. But without those experiences, how do I learn? How do I grow? Growth through suffering is a myth," Dr. Henley said. "A story we tell ourselves to make sense of pain. True growth comes from health, from clarity. I from the absence of dysfunction." He had an answer for every question, a gentle rebuttal to every concern. And sitting in that peaceful office, surrounded by the familiar smells and sounds of my childhood, it was easy to believe him. That night, Alina found me staring at old photo albums, trying to decode the expressions on my face in pictures I couldn't remember taking. "You've been different lately," she said, sitting beside me on the couch, distant, like you're looking for something. "Do you think I'm the same person you married?" I asked her. She was quiet for a long moment. "You're happier now," she said finally. "Less angry, less haunted, I guess. Whatever Dr. Henley did for you, it worked. But am I the same person? Does it matter? I love who you are now. I love this version of you." And there it was, the fundamental question that Dr. Henley's treatments raised. If the result was happiness, health, better relationships, did the method matter? Was the authentic self necessarily the better self? I went back to Dr. Henley one last time, not for treatment, but for answers. I wanted to understand not just what he did, but why he did it. "How long have you been practicing this kind of medicine?" I asked. "A very long time," he said. "I discovered the technique quite by accident, actually. I was treating a patient with severe depression, someone who had experienced unspeakable trauma. Traditional therapy wasn't helping, if anything. It was making things worse by forcing him to relive his worst experiences over and over. So you decided to remove the memories instead." It was a desperate measure. The patient was suicidal, completely non-functional. I had nothing left to lose. Dr. Henley's eyes grew distant, as if he were looking back across decades. The results were remarkable. Not just the immediate relief, but the long-term transformation. he became a different person, happier, more confident, free from the psychological prison his memories had created. And you've been doing this ever since. Only when necessary. Only when the memories serve no constructive purpose. He looked at me directly, like with you, when you were 12. Do you really wish you remembered watching your parents nearly destroy each other? The things they said, the way they used you as a weapon in their fights. I tried to imagine it, those missing months of childhood trauma, the emotional scars that would have shaped my ability to trust, to love, to believe in the permanence of relationships. Maybe I would have been stronger if I'd kept those memories, I said. But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. Or maybe you would have repeated their patterns. Dr. Henley replied. Maybe you would have brought their dysfunction into your relationship with Elena, poisoned your marriage with ancient toxins. We sat in silence for several minutes, the grandfather clock marking time with its steady rhythm. Finally, Dr. Henley spoke again. I offer a choice that few people ever get, he said. The ability to start fresh, unencumbered by the worst moments of your past. Not everyone takes it. Some people cling to their wounds like treasures, convinced that their suffering defines them. And those who do take it, they live lighter lives, happier lives. They become who they might have been if the world hadn't hurt them so badly. As I left his office that day, I realized I had a choice to make. I could try to recover my missing memories, could piece together the painful experiences that Dr. Henley had removed. Elena might help, or my parents or old friends. With enough effort, I might be able to reconstruct at least some of what had been taken. Or I could accept the gift. I'd been given a life edited of its worst chapters, a self unburdened by its heaviest traumas. That evening, I threw away my journal. I stopped asking questions about the gaps in my memory. I chose to trust that whatever Dr. Henley had taken from me, I was better off without it. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I still wonder about the person I used to be. The one who carried his scars like medals, who had earned his wisdom through suffering, rather than having his ignorance surgically maintained. I wonder if he would have been proud of who I've become, or if he would have seen me as a stranger wearing his face, living a life too clean to be real. The prescription bottle sits in my medicine cabinet still, with pills for ailments I haven't yet developed. Dr. Henley assures me that when the time comes, when life inevitably brings new traumas and complications, he'll be there to help, to edit, to heal. And I know, with a certainty that both comforts and terrifies me, that when that time comes, I'll let him. Story 8. I discovered the switch on a rain-soaked Thursday afternoon when I was 15, exploring the forgotten corners of our old colonial house while my parents attended yet another of their mysterious evening meetings in town. The basement had always been my refuge, a dim sanctuary filled with the comfortable mustiness of old cardboard boxes and the gentle hum of the water heater's eternal vigil. The switch sat on the wall beside the furnace, exactly where you'd expect to find one. Yet somehow I had never noticed it before, despite spending countless hours in that subterranean space. It was unremarkable in its appearance, a standard ivory toggle. Switch set into a metal plate that had yellowed with age. But when I flicked it up and down, listening for the familiar click of electrical connection, nothing happened. No light blazed to life, no fan whirred into motion, no hidden machinery awakened from slumber. At first, I assumed it was simply defunct, a relic from some long-forgotten electrical configuration. Old houses accumulate these orphaned switches like sediment, remnants of renovations and rewiring projects that leave behind switches connected to nothing. But something about this particular switch nagged at me with an intensity that defied rational explanation. I spent that evening methodically checking every light fixture, outlet, and appliance in the basement. The switch controlled none of them. I traced the electrical conduit running from its housing, following the metal tubing as it disappeared into the ceiling joists above. But when I examined the corresponding area on the ground floor, I found only solid wall, with no evidence of any light fixture or electrical device. The search consumed me with an obsession that surprised even myself. Over the following days, I mapped every switch in the house, creating detailed diagrams that showed the relationship between each control and its corresponding light or appliance. Every switch had a purpose, a clear function that revealed itself through simple experimentation. Every switch except the one in the basement. My parents seemed oddly unconcerned when I brought the mystery to their attention. Old houses have their quirks, my father said with a dismissive wave, not looking up from his evening paper. Probably controls some light that burned out years ago. But their explanation felt hollow, rehearsed, as if they had discussed this very scenario before. When I pressed for more details, asking about the house's electrical history, previous renovations, anything that might explain the switch's purpose, they became evasive in a way that made my skin crawl. Some things are better left alone, honey, my mother said, her voice carrying an undertone I had never heard before. The basement switch has always been there. It doesn't bother anyone. Their responses only intensified my curiosity. If the switch was truly meaningless, why did the subject make them so uncomfortable? And how could they be so certain it had always been there, when I, who had spent more time in the basement than either of them, had only just discovered it? I began experimenting with the switch in earnest, developing increasingly elaborate theories about its purpose. Perhaps it controlled an outdoor light that had been removed. Maybe it was connected to some hidden fixture, concealed behind a false wall. Or it could be part of an old three-way switching system that had been partially dismantled during a renovation. None of these explanations satisfied me, especially when my investigations revealed that the electrical conduit connected to the switch didn't follow any logical path through the house's wiring system. It seemed to disappear into the basement's concrete foundation, vanishing into solid stone and mortar. 3 weeks after discovering the switch, I noticed that flicking it had begun to produce a subtle effect, after all. If the basement's atmosphere would shift almost imperceptibly, the air growing slightly thicker, the shadows seeming to deepen in corners where no shadows should exist. The changes were so minimal that I convinced myself I was imagining them. But they occurred with such consistency that I began to document each occurrence in a notebook. I kept hidden beneath my mattress. "Switch activated at 3:47 p.m., I would write. Temperature seemed slightly warmer, humidity increased, sound quality different. Voices from upstairs seemed more distant. The entries accumulated over the following weeks, creating a catalogue of barely perceptible changes that occurred whenever I manipulated the mysterious switch. But as subtle as these effects were, they established a clear pattern. The switch did control something, even if that something defied conventional understanding. My sleep began to suffer as the mystery consumed more and more of my mental energy. I would lie awake at night thinking about the switch, planning new experiments, developing increasingly complex theories about its purpose. The obsession felt alien somehow, as if the ideas weren't entirely my own, but were being suggested by some external source. It was during one of these sleepless nights that I first heard the sound, a low humming that seemed to emanate from the basement, too faint to be certain, but persistent enough to draw me from my bed. I crept downstairs in bare feet, avoiding the creaky spots on the wooden steps that might alert my parents to my nocturnal investigations. The basement was exactly as I had left it, dimly lit by the single bare bulb that dangled from the ceiling, he casting familiar shadows across the familiar landscape of storage boxes and discarded furniture. But the humming was definitely coming from somewhere in that space, a sound like distant machinery, or perhaps voices speaking in harmony too far away to make out individual words. I approached the switch with trembling fingers, and the moment I touched its smooth plastic surface, the humming stopped. The silence that followed felt pregnant with possibility, as if the basement were holding its breath in anticipation of my next move. When I flicked the switch, the humming resumed, but now it seemed to be coming from a different direction. I followed the sound across the basement, weaving between obstacles in the dim light, until I found myself standing before the far wall. The wall that backed against the foundation of our neighbor's house. The humming was loudest here, and as I pressed my ear to the cold concrete, I could almost make out distinct voices within the drone. They spoke in what sounded like conversation, though the words were too muffled to understand. Multiple voices, overlapping and interweaving in patterns that suggested meaning just beyond my comprehension. Night after night, I returned to the basement to conduct my increasingly strange experiments. I would flip the switch and listen to the voices, trying to decode their messages occasionally catching fragments that sounded almost like words I recognized. Coming, I thought I heard once. Soon came another time. Ready, whispered a third. But the more I listened, the more I began to suspect that the voices weren't speaking to each other. They were speaking to me. The realization should have terrified me, but instead it filled me with a sense of profound anticipation. Something was trying to communicate, and I was the only person who could hear it. The switch wasn't controlling a light at all. It was controlling some form of connection, opening a channel between our basement and somewhere else. My parents' behavior grew increasingly strange during this period. They would watch me with expressions I couldn't quite interpret, as if they were waiting for something to happen. Their evening meetings in town became more frequent, sometimes leaving me alone in the house for hours at a time. Growing up is a process, my father said one morning out of nowhere, looking at me with eyes that seemed to see something beyond my physical presence. Everyone has to find their own path eventually. His words carried the same rehearsed quality I had noticed before. But now there was something else, a sadness that seemed almost nostalgic, as if he were remembering something bittersweet from his own past. 1 month after discovering the switch, I decided to conduct the most ambitious experiment yet. Instead of simply flicking the switch on and off, I would leave it in the wand, position for an extended period, and document any cumulative effects. The moment I activated the switch and walked away, the basement's atmosphere began to change in ways that were no longer subtle. The air grew thick and warm, carrying scents that had no place in that concrete space. Ocean salt, fresh pine, flowers I couldn't identify. The lighting shifted too, the harsh glare of the bare bulb somehow becoming softer, more diffuse, as if it were being filtered through layers of colored glass. But most remarkably, the voices grew clearer. I could now make out distinct words, entire phrases, conversations that seemed to be taking place just on the other side of the wall. They spoke about things I recognized, the weather, local events, people whose names I knew, but from perspectives that made no sense. They talked about my street as if it were somewhere else, described neighbors I had never met, referenced events that had never happened. It was as if I were listening to conversations from a parallel version of my own neighborhood, a place that was almost identical to my world, but subtly, fundamentally different. And the more I listened, the more I began to understand that the switch didn't just allow me to hear these other voices. It was somehow allowing them to hear me as well. Someone there. I whispered into the basement's transformed air, and the conversations on the other side stopped abruptly. After a long moment of silence, a single voice responded. It sounded like my own voice, but older somehow, carrying experiences I had never had. "We've been waiting for you to ask," it said. "We've been waiting for you to be ready." The conversation that followed defied every assumption I had ever held about the nature of reality. The voice, my voice, explained that the switch was a bridge between different versions of the same place, connecting basements that existed in parallel dimensions. Every house had such a switch, though most people never noticed them, never developed the curiosity or obsession necessary to activate their function. Where I am, the other me explained, our parents never bought this house. We moved to the coast when I was 12, and I grew up collecting seashells instead of hiding in basements. But the connection remains. All the possible versions of ourselves, all the choices we might have made, they're all still accessible if you know how to listen. Through that voice, I learned about dozens of other versions of my life. In one, I had become fascinated with astronomy and spent my nights mapping constellations. In another, I had discovered a talent for music and learned to play instruments that didn't exist in my world. In a third, a childhood illness had changed my entire trajectory, leading me to become something I could never have imagined. But with each conversation, I began to understand that the connection came with a cost. The more I learned about these other possibilities, the less substantial my own life began to feel. My friends started to seem like pale imitations of the more interesting versions I heard about from other dimensions. My experiences felt limited and constrained compared to the rich tapestries of possibility that stretched out through the parallel worlds. Accessible via the switch, the basement became my entire world. I would spend hours each day in communion with these other versions of myself, learning about lives I could have lived, choices I could have made. My grades suffered, my friendships dissolved, my parents' worried expressions deepened. But none of that seemed to matter compared to the vast network of possibility that the switch had revealed. It was another version of myself, one who had discovered his switch years earlier, who finally explained the true nature of what was happening. You're becoming unstuck, he told me, his voice carrying a wisdom that felt ancient despite sharing my age. The more you connect with us, the less connected you become to your own world. Eventually, you'll have to choose which version of yourself to be. The choice, when it came, wasn't dramatic. There was no moment of crisis, no supernatural intervention. Instead, it was simply a gradual recognition that I preferred the conversations in the basement to anything happening in the world above. The other versions of myself were more interesting, more accomplished. He more everything than the limited person I had become in this particular reality. So when the switch finally offered me the opportunity to trade places, to become one of the voices offering guidance to some other curious teenager who had just discovered their basement switch, I accepted without hesitation. Now I spend my days in a place that isn't quite a basement and isn't quite anywhere else, having conversations with the curious and the obsessed, helping them understand the nature of choice and possibility. Sometimes I speak to versions of myself, sometimes to completely different people who have found their own switches in their own forgotten corners. The basement where I started still exists, of course, and the switch still sits beside the furnace, waiting for the next curious soul to discover it. My parents, I'm told, speak of me as if I had gone away to college early, though I suspect they understand more about my true fate than they let on. And somewhere, in another basement, another teenager is just now noticing a switch they've never seen before, reaching out with trembling fingers to test its function, beginning the same journey of discovery that brought me here. The switch will work for them just as it worked for me. Because some mysteries are too compelling to resist, and some choices, once presented, demand to be explored to their ultimate conclusion. I can hear them now, actually, this new seeker, flicking the switch for the first time, listening for changes in their basement's atmosphere. Soon, they'll hear my voice among the others, offering wisdom and warning, and the terrible, beautiful gift of infinite possibility. The switch, I understand now, doesn't control a light at all. It controls the boundary between what is and what could be. And once that boundary becomes permeable, there's no going back to the simple certainty of a single life lived in a single reality. But then again, who would want to?